Hello, and welcome back to the Electronic Intifada's live stream for Wednesday, August 21st. Thank you for tuning in. I'm Nora Barrows-Friedman with my colleagues Ali Abunimah, John Elmer, Asa Winstanley, and Tamara Nassar. It's day 320 of Israel's genocide in Gaza. We have an important show for you today. Coming up, we'll have a discussion with Dr. Mohammed Marandi, professor of English literature and Orientalism at the University of Tehran, and a well-known analyst about Iran, Hezbollah, and what shape an expanded regional war could take. Later on in the program, John will take us through all the latest resistance news, including the battle in southern Gaza, an ambush in the Netzarim corridor, and the first look at Hezbollah's underground missile bases. But first, here's a summary of some of the latest developments in Gaza and the West Bank. And we'll also share some reportage highlights from the Electronic Intifada's contributors there. Israeli forces attacked areas across the Gaza Strip this past week, including in Jabalia in the north, Deir Balah, Nuseirat, and Bureij refugee camp in the center, and Al-Mawasi, Rafah, and Khan Yunis in the south. On Tuesday, the Israeli army committed yet another massacre in a school being used as a shelter for displaced people in Gaza City, killing at least 12, according to the Gaza government media office. Also on Tuesday in Deir Balah, at least 10 Palestinians were killed in two separate airstrikes on a densely populated market in the middle of the city. Al Jazeera's Hind Kurari reported that, quote, most of those who were wounded were children. We saw them in the hospital, in the corridors, lying on the ground, covered in blood and waiting for doctors. At the same time, we know that since Israeli forces took over the Philadelphia corridor, there has been no medical supplies entering Gaza, and that's why the number of casualties is expected to rise, she reported. Around the same time in Khan Yunis, she added, Israeli forces targeted an area people use for internet and battery charging, leading to 4 Palestinians being killed and many more wounded. The Israeli military spokesperson Daniel Hagari announced on Tuesday that the army expanded the ground invasion into Khan Yunis and north to the outskirts of Deir Balah. Today, Wednesday, the Israeli military issued new evacuation orders in Deir Balah in central Gaza, Al Jazeera reports, where hundreds of thousands of Palestinians displaced by the fighting have sought shelter. Israeli forces then fired into the crowds, killing at least one person and wounding several others, medics and residents said. Our contributor Abu Bakr Abed tweeted just hours ago that, quote, tanks are now bombing Deir Balah mercilessly, and bulldozers continue to erase lands east. People are terrified. People can't take it anymore. The Gaza government media office stated on Tuesday that the recent massacres, quote, come within the framework of completing the crime of genocide that the occupation uses many policies to meet, including the policy of targeting civilians in shelters and displacement centers and targeting civilian gatherings. Earlier in the week, Israel attacked other areas in Deir Balah, killing at least 30 people in 3 attacks between August 17th and 18th. Israel also bombed the beach refugee camp near Gaza City, killing at least 9 Palestinians, including children, and the Zuwayda neighborhood of Gaza City, where Israel bombed a shelter for displaced families. On Thursday, Israel bombed Jabalia refugee camp, killing at least 7 and injuring 20. On Friday, Israel targeted the Hamad City Towers, a residential complex in northern Khan Yunis that was completed in 2016, located on land where Israel had maintained illegal settlement colonies until 2005. Israeli forces had besieged most of the apartment towers already in March during its 6-month invasion of Khan Yunis.
لا إله إلا الله
عماد مش عارفين ربه وقول له روح غاد هو طلع اسوامه هيضربه كمان.
As people fled Hamad City and other areas in Khan Yunis seeking any place that could be a safe shelter, Israel announced new displacement orders, pushing people who have been displaced over and over again into an area that has shrunk to 11% of the Gaza Strip. Journalist and researcher Maha Husseini stated on Sunday that around 1 million Palestinians are now in Deir el-Balah following the latest displacement orders, concentrating nearly half of Gaza's population into a town that lacks even the most basic infrastructure and is also under Israeli bombardment. Dr. Mustafa Al-Masri, a psychiatrist, stated that his team was forced to relocate twice in less than 12 hours. Quote, "Zionists are chasing us around in circles," he said. 2 more journalists were killed this week in Israeli attacks, bringing the number of reporters and media workers killed since October to 170. On Tuesday, photographer and journalist Hamza Abdulrahman Murtaja was killed in the airstrike on the Mustafa Hafez school in Gaza City. Hamza was the brother of Yasser Murtaja, the videographer and reporter who was executed by an Israeli sniper during the Great March of Return in 2018. Journalist Ibrahim Marwan Muharrab was killed on Sunday when Israeli forces fired at a group of journalists gathered in Hamad City in Khan Yunis. Muharrab worked for several international media outlets. In that same attack, Israeli forces shot journalist Salma al-Kaddoumi. She was injured but survived. The United Nations delivered fuel to the northern Gaza Strip to help keep essential services like bakeries and health facilities running, according to the UN on Monday, though the amount delivered by the convoy, they said, was, quote, far from enough. Severe shortages of fuel, medications, and medical supplies continue, especially in the north, where Israel has completely destroyed entire neighborhoods and necessary infrastructure. United Nations spokesperson Louise Wateridge filmed this video of the landscape in northern Gaza on Tuesday. Along with the video, she stated, quote, "There are buildings without damage or total destruction anymore. Any building fully intact stands out. Hundreds of thousands of homes and lives destroyed. Stories of children, mothers, fathers, even entire families still buried underneath rubble. Cities are now graveyards. Strikes are now relentless. The day starts with people checking if family and friends are still alive and ends hoping they make it through the night. Destruction on such staggering scale that minimal structures remain. With nowhere else to turn, displaced families live among rubble." As we've been reporting, physicians and international health organizations have warned that because of the destroyed infrastructure, lack of sanitation, and Israel's ongoing prevention of basic hygiene supplies from entering Gaza, irreversible diseases and epidemics are taking hold. The Ministry of Health in Gaza this week has reported the first case of the polio virus in a 10-month-old child. Our senior editor, Maureen Claire Murphy, reports that aid agencies and medical professionals are calling for a ceasefire to administer the polio vaccine to 640,000 children under the age of 10 in Gaza after a case was confirmed in the territory. It's the first case of polio in Gaza in 25 years, CNN reported. The highly contagious disease mainly affects young children, and serious cases can lead to permanent paralysis and death. Dozens of international aid groups and medical professionals stated on Tuesday that, quote, "at least 50,000 children born during the past 10 months of hostilities are highly unlikely to have received any immunizations due to the collapsed health system." Last week, the UN Children's Fund, UNICEF, and the World Health Organization requested humanitarian pauses for 7 days to allow for 2 rounds of vaccinations in Gaza. Without the humanitarian pauses, the 2 UN agencies said, the delivery of the campaign will not be possible. Worryingly, 3 children presenting with suspected acute flaccid paralysis, a common symptom of polio, have since been reported in the Gaza Strip, UNICEF and the World Health Organization added. Now that polio is confirmed in Gaza, quote, "children do not have the luxury of time," said Jeremy Stowe for Save the Children. A polio vaccine campaign must reach at least 95% of targeted children to be effective, according to the aid groups and doctors. Quote, "This cannot happen in an active war zone," they said. For much more on this story, read Maureen Claire Murphy's latest report, Ceasefire Needed to Avert Mass Polio Outbreak in Gaza, on electronicintifada.net. This week, we'll highlight two recent features published by our writers in Gaza, focusing on parents and children and their direct experiences living under constant bombardment. Jumana Taysir writes that Ali Al-Aswad, 23, and his cousin Mohammed, 21, counted the shells as they exploded around their home in Gaza's Jabalia refugee camp in December. The Israeli army had launched a major offensive on the camp, and the barrage of shells was constant and terrifying. The cousins, Jumana writes, counted 13 to 15 explosions per minute. The family was forced to leave home at 6 a.m. due to the ongoing barrage. Their first stop was a distribution point run by the UN Agency for Palestine Refugees, or UNRWA. Yet by 1 p.m., missiles had already struck a nearby mosque. They were forced to flee once more, this time to an UNRWA school. It felt like the only thing between them and certain death were the walls of the school. The Al-Aswad family was finally told they could return home nearly 2 weeks later. That morning, quote, "A truck came to pick up our belongings," he said. "Mattresses, bags, and everything we had brought with us. My older brother and my cousin Mohammed insisted on taking the truck despite my pleas to go myself." 16 minutes later, tragedy would strike. Israeli missiles targeted residential blocks in Jabalia camp that included the home of the Al-Aswad family. That was from Jumana Taysir's feature, A Family Tragedy in Jabalia Refugee Camp. And our contributor, Fida Al-Kedra, wrote a personal story this week about her daughter, Rita. She writes, quote, "For Rita, I've always chosen everything carefully. Her beautiful room, her toys, her dresses, and her clothes, her hairstyles, her kindergarten. I was proud of myself and her father as we tried with all our might to provide our daughter with a healthy and safe environment, surrounded by warmth and love in which she could grow up far from all the conflicts and challenges that we parents live in, an environment fertile with wars. Now my daughter is experiencing genocide at a very young age. Instead of growing up in an atmosphere of love and safety and exercising her right to learn and play, she has lived through over 300 days of continuous bombing, displacement, hunger, and disease. I, as a mother, have lived with 9 months of anxiety about my daughter and her future. Her simplest needs have become a major challenge. We have suffered a lot in obtaining appropriate food, clothes, and clean water for our children. I live this war as a journalist, as a mother, and as a woman. I'm not used to it yet. Whenever I see a child's corpse, it reminds me of the danger facing my daughter here and the sad truth that our children's lives have no value as long as the world watches the killing of their childhood and remains silent." Read more from Fida Al-Kedra's feature, Genocide in a Child's Mind, on electronicintifada.net. And turning to the occupied West Bank, Israel shot and killed Mahmoud Ibrahim al-Harub, an 18-year-old youth in Dura, south of Hebron, on Monday. The Wafa news agency reported that Israeli forces stormed the town, sparking confrontations, during which the occupation soldiers fired live bullets, sound bombs, and toxic gas at the young men, which led to the injury of 2 young men by bullets, one of whom was Al-Harub, in addition to dozens of suffocation injuries. With the killing of Al-Harub, the number of slain Palestinians in the West Bank, including occupied Jerusalem, since October 7th, has risen to 636, including 147 children. At least 5,400 Palestinians have been injured in the same time period, Wafa reports. Meanwhile, Israeli forces continued to demolish houses and structures as its top lawmakers boasted of plans to build a new illegal settlement colony on the land of Batir, an ancient Palestinian village west of Bethlehem, and the village of my colleague Ali Abunima's father's family. According to the Times of Israel, quote, the establishment of Nahal Heletz was formally approved by the government in June this year, along with the retroactive legalization of 4 West Bank outposts. The order was celebrated by extremist right-wing finance minister Bezalel Smotrich, who said it would help connect Jerusalem to the Gush Etzion settlement bloc, one of the largest colonies in the occupied West Bank. Batir was designated as a UNESCO World Heritage Site 10 years ago. The UN Human Rights Office has said it is, quote, alarmed by Israel's recent and ongoing settlement expansion and legal changes in the occupied West Bank, measures which fly in the face of international law, including a landmark ruling by the International Court of Justice in July. And finally, we wanted to bring you some images and videos from journalists and others in Gaza that highlight the resilience, joy, and determination of the Palestinian people. Our dear contributor Abu Bakr Abed posted this video of the moon in Deir al-Balah on Monday night with the caption, "Here's my area. We're physically on the dark side, but we are spiritually shining on the bright side. Keep protesting, boycotting, divesting, and acting. The moon is a source of hope for us, not only light. You're our moon," he said. And displaced Palestinian children played and cuddled with cats and dogs in a shelter last week as part of an animal therapy initiative in Deir al-Balah. Middle East Monitor said that Basmet Amal Center held this session to help Palestinian children with special needs who had to leave their homes due to Israeli attack. And a similar event took place in southern Gaza, organized by the Sulala Animal Rescue Group. They said, quote, "We brought a puppy and a cat for the children to meet. Some of them responded by bringing their own pets." And that's it for the news roundup. As always, go to electronicintifada.net for much more, especially to read our new features by our brave writers in Gaza. I'm Nora Barrows-Friedman with my colleague Ali Abunimah. Hi, Ali.
Hi, Nora. Sometimes I can't even make it through the news. Sorry.
I know.
But I think, I'm particularly concerned about many of our friends in Gaza. I'm thinking about Abu Bakr. The situation now in Deir al-Balah is extremely bad, and he's asked everyone to protest, to boycott, but also to pray for the safety of everyone there. And we offer our hopes and prayers that he and all his family and community will be safe.
Yeah, it's been unbearable reading his tweets over the last few hours, looking at those photos of the line of tanks just a couple hundred meters away from where he is. I think we're all just wrecks right now.
And I was in touch with him. We were in touch earlier this morning, and I told him we'd be thinking about him when we go live. We hope to get him, to have him with us soon. Yeah. And while we're waiting to reconnect with our next guest, I'll also just say, okay, I think we're ready to go. But I also just want to say that what's happening in Batir, our village, when it happens that close to home, you really feel it. But it is exactly what is happening all over Palestine, no different. What my family, what all families are experiencing is exactly the same. We're not any different.
No, exactly. And yeah, I mean, there's so much to, there's so much that we have to absorb every day, every hour. And it's really important to take care of ourselves. And that goes for our audience too. And it's sometimes it just feels like too much, but yeah. Anyway, we have a huge, a wonderful show for you today. And Ali, why don't you introduce our guest?
With pleasure. So, recalling that on July 31st, Ismail Haniyeh, the head of the political bureau of Hamas, was assassinated while he was visiting Tehran for the inauguration of Iran's newly elected president, Masoud Pezeshkian. The country's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps said that Haniyeh was assassinated with a short-range projectile with a warhead of approximately 7 kilograms that was fired at the closely guarded official guest house where Haniyeh was staying. The attack also killed Haniyeh's bodyguard, Wasim Abu Sha'ban. Since then, few other details have emerged about exactly how the murder was carried out, but Iran insists, and no one seriously doubts this, that Israel was behind it. On the same day as Haniyeh's assassination, Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Sayyid Ali Khamenei, stated, following this bitter, tragic event which has taken place within the borders of the Islamic Republic, it is our duty to take revenge. Khamenei led the prayers for Haniyeh and Abu Sha'ban at an enormous funeral in Tehran. The murder of Haniyeh came just hours after Israel bombed residential buildings in the southern suburb of the Lebanese capital, Beirut. Among those killed in the attack was Fuad Shukr, a senior commander of the resistance group Hezbollah. Hezbollah Secretary General Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah vowed that his group's retaliation would be definite, strong, and effective. For 3 weeks now, there has been an anxious wait in Israel and across the region for when these retaliatory operations might come and what shape they might take. And recall, too, that Yemen's Ansarullah movement has also vowed to retaliate directly against Israel for its bombing of the Yemeni port of Hudaydah on July 22nd. Iran, Hezbollah, and Ansarullah have left Israel guessing as to whether their retaliatory operations will be separate or coordinated. In the meantime, the deadly exchanges of missiles, air raids, and artillery between Israeli forces and Hezbollah fighters across the Lebanon-Israeli boundary have escalated in intensity, and the United States is positioning more of its forces in the region. Washington is trying to cobble together another regional coalition to defend Israel from the expected responses. Back in April, the Americans led just such a coalition made up of its European allies and local Arab vassals to try to fend off an Iranian drone and missile strike against Israeli targets in retaliation for Israel's bombing of Iran's consulate in Damascus. On August 20th, that's yesterday, Brigadier General Ali Mohammad Naini, the spokesperson for Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, said, quote, "Time is on our side, and the waiting period for our response to the criminal Zionist regime may extend longer than expected." According to the Tehran Times, General Naini stressed that creating a state of uncertainty in Israel is intentional, as Iran's response will be carefully timed and different from past operations. That echoed comments by Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah earlier this month when he said that making Israel wait is, quote, part of the punishment. All the while, Israel's American-armed Holocaust in Gaza accelerates with no end in sight. Joining us now to talk about all this is Dr. Mohammad Marandi, professor of English literature and Orientalism at the University of Tehran. Dr. Marandi is well known for his highly informed commentary and sharp debating skills, and we're delighted to welcome him back to the Electronic Intifada live stream. Dr. Marandi, we're especially grateful that you are joining us from Beijing, where the time now is just past midnight. Thank you so much for staying up late with us after such a long day.
Thank you, Ali. Thank you, Noah.
Thank you. So you've just heard the comments from the Revolutionary Guard Commander, General Naini, and let me recall that just over a week ago, 3 senior Iranian officials told the Reuters news agency that Tehran would hold back from its planned retaliation if there was a quick end to Israel's genocide in Gaza. Reuters reported, quote, one of the sources, a senior Iranian security official, said Iran, along with allies such as Hezbollah, would launch a direct attack on Israel if the Gaza talks fail or if it perceives Israel is dragging out negotiations, end quote. And hours after that Reuters report, President Joe Biden was asked if he thought a ceasefire deal would convince Iran to forego its military response. He responded, quote, "That's my expectation." It seems clear now that these negotiations have been going absolutely nowhere as Israel and the United States play a game of bait and switch, putting forward proposals that Washington claims Israel has endorsed and then snatching them away and starting the process from scratch as soon as Hamas agrees to anything. Dr. Marandi, in your opinion, is there or was there some kind of behind-the-scenes negotiation between Washington and Tehran? And is there any prospect of it leading to an end to the genocide? And if there is no ceasefire, is there a risk that Israel will interpret the lack of an Iranian response so far to Tel Aviv's aggression as a sign of weakness?
I think we have to divide this into different parts. First of all, anything that Reuters says when it comes to Iran and other media outlets in the West, legacy media outlets, but Reuters in particular, whenever they say an unnamed Iranian official or security official, they're making it up. There is no high-ranking official in Iran who would speak to a Reuters journalist. And therefore, I would throw that in the bin first and foremost. The Iranian response will happen. That is something about which there's no doubt. And Biden's expectation or Trump's expectation or Harris's expectation is worthless. The Iranians will strike the Israeli regime, and they will strike them and hurt the regime. The Iranians are always, or I should say regularly, in some sort of communication with Americans. And this has been going on for years. Messages always go back and forth. Sometimes they're indirect negotiations, as we've seen in Vienna or in Oman. And often there are written messages that go back and forth. But there is no agreement between the United States and Iran with regards to the Iranian strike, and there will be no agreement. The second issue is that Iran supports Hamas and its position at the negotiating table. And Iran wants an immediate ceasefire, but under terms that are acceptable to Hamas. Whenever Hamas agrees to a ceasefire, a permanent ceasefire, under conditions that Hamas accepts, and the original proposal put forward by the Americans, which the Americans said the Israelis not only accepted, but that it was really an Israeli proposal, even though it was a lie. Hamas gave that a positive response. They gave a positive response to the American proposal. But the Americans, of course, as usual, they moved the goalposts. And now they want an agreement that serves Netanyahu's interests. And that's unacceptable to Hamas. If Hamas agrees to a deal that is fair and just, the collective resistance, the axis of resistance, which includes Yemen, Iran, Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, all of them based on the agreement accepted by Hamas, would also halt the military conflict. But until then, the Israeli regime will have to accept the fact that Hezbollah will strike it from the north, Ansarullah, or the Houthis, will block the Red Sea, and Iraq, the resistance in Iraq and Syria will continue to work against the Israeli regime. And of course, Iran will give all of these entities, including Gaza, its full support and that support includes everything. But all that aside, the Iranian response to the Israeli regime will take place whether there is a ceasefire or whether there is or is not a ceasefire. That is definite. Why will Iran respond? There are a host of reasons. Obviously, the Israeli regime has to be punished for the genocide, and Iran will punish the regime. But the United Nations, the international community, countries across the world will face a number of Iranian arguments. A, international law was breached. Iranian sovereignty was undermined. The Israeli regime carried out an assassination against a senior figure, an international figure, Shahid Haniyeh, on Iranian territory. A guest of Iran, an official guest of Iran, a guest of the president of the Islamic Republic of Iran, who attended his inaugural ceremony. Hours after that ceremony, he was murdered in an official guest house through a missile that was fired from the hilltops around Tehran, the hills surrounding the city, to the north of the city. So he was a senior official, was an official guest of Iran, a very close friend of Ayatollah Khamenei, of the new president, and who was also a household name in Iran. Thus, the millions of people who we saw in the streets of Tehran who attended his funeral, and Ayatollah Khamenei carried out the funeral, led the funeral prayers himself. So Ayatollah Khamenei said that Iran will seek revenge. And he used in Persian, a harsh word for revenge. So that is going to happen. The 3 weeks that we've seen pass has been very costly for the regime. It's not just people fearing a strike. The regime has been forced to move important components inside military bases. They've been moving around key parts of key installations. People are fearful from going to work in the military, in intelligence, in key infrastructure. It has caused a lot of harm to the way in which the Israeli military and intelligence conducts itself, the way in which everyday business is carried out, how key infrastructure is managed, and also it creates a constant fear among Israelis, but also it creates tension and concern for all of the regime's business partners across the world and its key partners in the West, its partners in crime across the West. So businesses that contemplate working with the Israeli regime, every day they're hearing about a possible Iranian strike today. They're hearing the same, of course, from Yemen and Lebanon, but the strike from Iran will be unique, it will be direct, and it will be more severe than the strike which was carried out in April. That strike, and this is the final point that I should add, that strike was intended to create an environment where the Israeli regime would no longer attack Iran. In other words, Iran wanted to create deterrence. But of course, after 2-3 months, that deterrence has faded away. So the Iranians will have to create deterrence again and hit the regime in a way that it recognizes that this was too costly for the regime. So deterrence is also another key issue.
Dr. Marandi, let's talk a little bit more about that operation in April. It was, as you said, it was calibrated to demonstrate Iran's capabilities and deter the Israeli aggression. But just a few months later, Israel carried out the attack on Beirut and the murder of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran. So clearly deterrence has failed at some level. Do you think Iran miscalculated in thinking that the Israelis and their American sponsors are more rational than they really are?
Well, Nora, that's I think a key question. As you know, the deterrence that was carried out in April was intended to punish the Israeli regime, but more important than punishing the regime, it was also an important intelligence gathering operation. Yeah. As you know, Iran fired 300 drones and missiles, roughly. Most of them were old drones and old missiles, very cheap, and basically the Iranians wanted to get rid of them. So the Israeli regime was forced, and the Americans, because most of the work was done by the Americans, not the Israelis. The Israeli regime and the Americans combined spent roughly $4 billion in stopping these drones and missiles, whereas they didn't cost Iran much. But more importantly, the Iranians wanted to see what capabilities the Americans have and what capabilities the Israeli regime has, and what regional installations are being used. The Americans use their base in Turkey. They use their base in Qatar, in Doha, near Doha. They use their bases in Bahrain, and of course elsewhere. And of course, Jordan was at the. They were basically working for the Americans, and they gave clearance to the Americans and the Israelis to use their airspace to block the Iranian attack, whereas the Jordanian regime would always allow Israeli planes to fly over Jordan to bomb Syria. So when it comes to bombing Syria, over the years, the Jordanians are on board. When it comes to retaliation against a genocidal regime, the King of Jordan has serious problems. Not only does he have serious problems with that, but he actively helps the regime and its allies to block the attack. So the Iranians gathered intelligence. They imposed a cost, but also the Iranians fired a number of advanced missiles, roughly a dozen, I think. I don't know the exact number, at two bases, one the air base in the south and an intelligence base near the Golan. And those missiles all got through the shield. So that was also a message to the regime. Deterrence was created. And partially as a result of that deterrence, the resistance in Lebanon and elsewhere has capabilities, or better capabilities today than they had before. So for a few months, the Israeli regime was cautious. It no longer struck Iranian officials or Iranian advisors in Syria. And so I think it's fair to say that a lot was done during that period to help the defense of Lebanon and the defense of Syria. But it wasn't enough. So it may have been a miscalculation, but I think also the Iranians may say that if we had done anything more than that, it could have caused problems with our friends and allies. Because we have to keep in mind that just as the United States, the Europeans, Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand are a part of this axis of genocide, Iran's allies across the global south are opposed to the genocide. BRICS nations, regional nations, neighboring countries, countries across the global south, they are fearful about war. Because obviously if there is a war, if the war expands, and we can get into that later, it could possibly bring down the whole global economy without any exaggeration. It could be significantly worse than the 1930s in the United States. Because of course, all the oil and gas installations in the Persian Gulf could possibly be destroyed. But Iran wants to show countries across the global south that it is not the side that is expanding the conflict. it has not brought about escalation. So its response was to gain information, it was to hurt the regime, it was to create deterrence, and it was also carried out in a way to assure countries across the global south that the problem lies in Tel Aviv and, of course, across the West. So this time round, the delay, I think it's fair to say, is partially psychological warfare, partially to create difficulty for the Israeli regime, as I explained earlier. But also, Iran went through the motions. It spoke to countries across the world. And the foreign minister has been very active over the last 3 weeks to make sure that everyone understood where things stand and who is and which side is a cause for concern for the global community, not only for the Holocaust in Gaza, which is, in a certain way, it is the greatest crime in human history because it's being carried out live in front of the world. Past genocides and catastrophically huge numbers of people being killed in different countries and continents were carried out without public knowledge, without people across the world knowing about it, let alone watching it. So this, in some ways, is the worst crime that the world has ever seen. We were being forced to watch it day and night. But countries across the global south are also worried about the future of their own economies, their own people, their own country, and their own stability. So Iran wants to make sure that countries across the world recognize that the problem lies in the West and with the Israeli regime. But also, Iran is warning the West that an escalation would be catastrophic for them too. Because if the United States gets involved, if the United States makes the stupid mistake of striking Iran, then all of its bases in the Persian Gulf region and in Iraq are targets. But more than that, all those regimes, those family dictatorships, those city-states that host those bases, they are hostile. And therefore, their key infrastructure will be targeted. There will be no gas and no oil coming from the Persian Gulf region. And American bases in Iraq will be overrun by the Iraqi resistance. Syria, of course, will be the same. So the United States has been made to understand what the situation is and how far this can go. And the same is true with the Europeans. So Iran has to speak to its allies and friends across the global south. It has to make sure the axis of genocide in the West understands where things stand. And at the same time, it is carrying out psychological warfare against the Israelis, which has consequences.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah. Just one follow-up. You mentioned Jordan and the role it's played. Of course, Jordan took part in the coalition to defend Israel in April from Iran's retaliation. And a couple of weeks ago, the Jordanian foreign minister, Ayman al-Safadi, visited Tehran. This was notable because such visits by senior Jordanian officials to Iran are rare. And there have been quite conflicting reports about what was discussed in that meeting, whether he was carrying certain messages, whether he received certain messages. And there's been a lot of speculation about it. I wonder, can you shed any light on what was behind that meeting?
Well, unlike Reuters and other Western media outlets that has all this access to the inner circles of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and they often can tell us what they're eating for lunch and for dinner, I don't have that direct access, but I have been told by people who haven't been part of the negotiations, but who are generally well informed, that the Jordanians came basically to plead for Iran not to strike. And they basically said that, this is my understanding. So I don't know if this is accurate, but people who generally seem to know things said this to me. And the second was that the Jordanians said that ultimately, if something does happen, they will have to take sides with the Americans.
I mean, you know, you laid out in such clear detail what would be needed to avert this, you know, global catastrophe if the West and its you know, settler project colony state Israel decides to keep the genocide going and keep provoking you know, the world into an escalation and a wider regional war. Do you think that that it is at all possible for the U.S. and for Israel to concede to the demands of regional governments like Iran, like Hezbollah, and back down and do the right thing and adhere to international humanitarian law, as you know, meager as its value has been lately? Or do you think that it's at all absurd to try and think of, you know, the U.S. primarily, but also Europe and Israel, to be anything less than, you know, aggressive and reckless and ready to escalate? Do you think a wider war is inevitable when we're dealing with the enemies that we're dealing with?
I think a wider war is possible, and Iran has no option but to retaliate, because, as I said, if Iran doesn't retaliate, then deterrence won't be established. And if deterrence is not established, the Netanyahu regime will carry out further acts of terror. There's no doubt about it. And then when greater acts of terror are carried out, then the Iranians will still have to respond. So Iran has to respond now. It cannot forgive and forget. That's impossible. Of course, forgiving is impossible, and forgetting is impossible, each separately. But the possibility of an expanded war is there. I find it somewhat unlikely because the stakes are very high, very, very high. But I also think that, yes, at some point, the Israeli regime will have to accept defeat, because it has already been defeated. Not only has the Israeli regime been defeated, the collective West has been defeated. Not only has the collective West been defeated, but even those who pretend to support the Palestinian people, or who support women's rights, or who support human rights or animal rights, or whatever rights it is that is fashionable nowadays in NATO countries, they've all been defeated. They are all those who continue to do business with the Israeli regime, those who continue to have political relations with the regime. It's a defeat for all of them, the continuation of this war, because they're all humiliated. They're all complicit. The Europeans and the Americans, though, are at the top of this list. They have been crushed by this genocide because they've been exposed to the world for what they really are. They're the greatest violators of human rights in the world. And you know what makes it especially disgusting for people across the global South, in my opinion, is that people across the global South, when they see these when they see these images online, they recall their own history. They recall the history of their own people, whether it's in Southern Africa or the subcontinent or Southeast Asia or North Africa or Latin America. They all have a history of genocide and brutality and colonialism and racism from the West, whether in the 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th, or 21st century. Every people has their own story or stories. And so when they see the genocide in Gaza, they see a repeat of their own history. And so the West has been demolished. It is nothing. The political regime in the West is worthless. And the Israeli regime is destroyed. It's not just the defeat in Gaza, where they've been unable to take this dot on the map. They've been unable to defeat Hamas and its allies, Islamic Jihad and the others. They've carried out the genocide, but I think that is what has destroyed it. They've been defeated, therefore, in Gaza. But it's not just that. It's not just being defeated on the border with Hezbollah and failing to stop Hezbollah's strikes in northern Palestine. It's not just the fact that they failed to defeat Ansarullah and the Yemeni armed forces in the Red Sea. And it's not just the Israeli regime, it's the Americans who are fighting on their behalf and the British who are fighting on they failed. It's not just the fact that the Americans failed to defeat the Iraq resistance in Iraq and Syria. The defeat is the genocide. All of these combined have shown the world that the Israeli regime is weak, vulnerable, totally dependent on the West, totally dependent on handouts, and dependent on Western political cover. That's not a state. That's not a legitimate entity. That is a weak and vulnerable colony. Only a weak and vulnerable colony could act in this way. So it has been defeated. No one believes anything about this invincible army anymore, or Israeli high-tech intelligence gathering. They didn't even know what was going on under Gaza. They have no idea about the capabilities of Hezbollah, let alone Iran or anyone else. So the regime is ultimately going to have to accept a ceasefire. Whether that's tomorrow or in 6 months, neither Trump nor Harris has the ability to turn the tide or to change the equation to benefit the Israeli regime. Neither of them have this capability. Trump has no special powers that Biden did not have. And neither does Harris. So at some point, the regime is going to have to accept reality. The later they understand this, the later they're forced to do this, the worse it is for the regime. The longer this war lasts, the more entrenched the hatred for this regime. In China, people hate the Israeli regime. This was not how it was a year ago. People despise the regime here. So the regime, the longer it takes, the more entrenched the hatred and animosity becomes. And the more it expands the war, again, the worse it is for the regime. So they are in a lose-lose situation. I believe that we are witnessing the last years of this Zionist entity. Yeah. I don't know when it will collapse, but I have no doubt that ultimately the regime will collapse and we will have a Palestine where Jews, Muslims, and Christians are all considered to be equal human beings.
Well, that's. I want to ask you. I want to ask you a question about Iran, but before we get to that, I just want to follow up on something you just said. Of course, I think the picture you paint is persuasive to many of us. I think the big picture, but if I were trying to defend Israel, I would say, well, Dr. Marandi, look how we could, or of course the Israelis don't say this, they remain silent, but they were able to carry out a serious breach of security in the heart of Tehran. They were able to murder 𝐓𝐡𝐞 𝐄𝐥𝐞𝐜, there's a senior commander, one of the founding and most senior commanders in Hezbollah. So they would say, well, our intelligence is great, and we can get anyone we want anytime we want. And so are you not being too overconfident, Dr. Marandi?
No, I think it's very clear that these acts are carried out with the support of the collective West. The Israeli regime is being supported by U.S. intelligence agencies. It is being supported by the Five Eyes, which includes that nice and friendly New Zealand somewhere in the South Pacific or wherever it is. It's being supported by Western embassies in Iran, which have always been gathering intelligence and working against the country. It's being aided by Western embassies and some non-Western embassies in countries surrounding Iran, and of course some non-Western embassies in Iran itself. So Iran and the axis of resistance, Iran, Yemen, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine, they're standing up against a huge coalition, this axis of genocide. Very powerful. The Israeli regime is not powerful. If the Americans stopped sending weapons, forget European support and the support of others. If the Americans stopped the sales of weapons, they don't sell weapons to Israel, they give them all as gifts. They're not really sold. But if the Americans stopped sending weapons to Israel, could the regime continue this war for a week? They've lost in Gaza with all the intelligence and military support and financial support and political support that the West has given it. All that support is being used against Iran as well. But the regime will fail. So yes, it comes at a price. The maximum pressure sanctions are a part of it. Why has Iran been suffering under maximum pressure all these years? These sanctions are not because of Iran's nuclear program. They're not because of Iran, terrorism or human rights, or it's all about the Israeli regime. It's all about Palestine. It's always been about Palestine. Iran's the liberation of Palestine is a central principle for the Islamic Republic of Iran. Just like Iran's support for the resistance in Southern Africa, Iran's support for the resistance against apartheid, the resistance against Israel and the apartheid regime in Israel has always been a key principle of Iranian foreign policy, and that is why Iran is punished. And have no doubt, Ali, that if Iran compromised today with the Americans would give Iran the world. They would give Yemen half the world. They would give Hezbollah half the world. But this is a principle. The Palestinian people have to be liberated. It's unacceptable to have such a genocidal apartheid regime in our part of the world. Not only for moral reasons, but also for strategic reasons. Do you think that I mean, I know you don't, you know this, but and I know your audience is very political aware, so, and I know they all know more or less everything that I say, and I'm sorry that I bore them, but
far from it.
Does anyone seriously think that the Americans will ever, or the Europeans ever, allow West Asia or North Africa to thrive as long as there's an Israel? They will always make sure that the countries in this region are vulnerable and weak, from Iran to Egypt to everywhere across the region. Because Israel has, the interests of Israel are paramount. That's why they allow them to carry out a genocide. So there is a coalition of countries that are working against Iran. And Iran has paid a price, whether through sanctions or whether the assassination of its nuclear scientists or the assassination of its military advisors in Syria, just as Syria has paid a huge price. What was the dirty war in Syria all about? ISIS and Al-Qaeda and all these freedom fighters. They were all about undermining Syria because of Israel. We now see that. Remember that how the Israeli regime said that they preferred ISIS to Assad. Why? Because Syria is key to the resistance in Lebanon, to the ability of Hezbollah to support its allies and for the Hezbollah to be able to strike the Israeli regime. The destruction of Iraq, the genocidal war in Yemen, Libya, all of this, each and every one of them has more to do with the interests of the Israeli regime than anything else. So it's a matter of principle, and it is a matter of fact that our region cannot be normal as long as there is an Israel. So it will be tough. It will be difficult. And the road ahead is not going to be an easy road. But this genocidal regime has to leave the region. It has to end. And the Iranians and the resistance and the people of the region and the people across the world, they all believe that. No one, I think that in your country, in the United States, increasingly people recognize what's happening despite the media and across Europe. But across the global south, here in China, here in Beijing, that's what everyone is telling me. That the sentiment online, at university, on the streets, is totally against the Israeli regime, whereas this was not the case here.
Well, I just want to say, among the thousands of people who are watching us live now, many are writing comments that I don't think you can see, but I can assure you they are saying very emphatically that you do not bore us, and they are hanging on your every word. So, and your time is precious and it's late. So we have a couple more questions before we let you go. And I want to shift now towards Iranian politics. President Masoud Pezeshkian was inaugurated following his victory in the election held in the wake of the death of President Ibrahim Raisi and several other senior officials in that helicopter crash back in May. In the standard, rather cliched Western view of Iranian politics, there are two types of Iranians, so-called reformists and so-called hardliners. Could you give us a more nuanced view of the Iranian political map and tell us something about President Pezeshkian and where he fits in the Iranian political scene? And I'd also like you to comment on the reports that this election had the lowest turnout in the history of the Islamic Republic, with just under 50% in the second round, and it was a few points lower than that in the first round. Are voters in Iran as disaffected as electorates in many Western countries? For example, in the recent general election in the United Kingdom, the turnout was just 50%, the lowest turnout since universal suffrage began in Britain in 1928.
Yes, I think that is a part of it. The maximum pressure sanctions have made life difficult for many Iranians, if not most, and I think I would imagine most by a large majority. Their lives have been affected by the sanctions, and these sanctions have been going on for many years. So I think that is a part of it. And the intention of those sanctions is to make people desperate, whether it's Iran or Venezuela or Cuba. The intention is to crush civil society, to crush people, and to make people so desperate that they will rebel, that they will turn against their governments in desperation, sort of like what they did in Nicaragua when the Sandinistas in the 80s, they were constantly brutalized. Their country was brutalized by the Americans. And then when there were elections, people voted for the pro-American candidate, but ultimately they went back to the Sandinistas because they saw that voting pro-American does them no good. Like everywhere else in the world, the pro-American and the pro-Western candidates are only there to plunder and to take away the sovereignty of different countries. So, and that's why we have the Sandinistas in power today. And what we see in Venezuela. I was in Venezuela. I was invited by the Venezuelans as one of roughly 1,000 election observers. And it was clear from before the election, even though we were going from polling station to polling station and seeing how the system works and how very difficult it would be to have extensive voter fraud. But well before the elections, they were the United States and the enemies of the Venezuelan government were saying that there's going to be fraud. And they were speaking about a landslide in favor of the pro-American candidate well before the election took place. So it was clear that they had a plan for election day and the day after. So sanctions are basically to brutalize people into submission and even further rebellion. So there is apathy in Iran, but I also think part of it is because of the fact that President Raisi, he was a popular president, especially when he died, because people saw how suddenly it dawned upon them how hardworking he was. Going from province to province, town, villages, the most deprived areas in the country, day and night. He worked 7 days a week. And it was, when he passed away, when he died, I was invited on the BBC that morning when it was officially announced. And they brought in these so-called Iranian guests from, I think, Canada or England, one from Canada, one from the UK, to people who were saying people across Iran are celebrating and they're all joyful about his death. And when the host came to me, I said that, what are you going to do when the funerals begin? When millions of people come to the streets, how are you going to justify this fake narrative that you're promoting? And 3 days later, the same show, and I think it was a different producer, by mistake, they invited me again after the funeral in Tehran, because there was a huge funeral in Tabriz. And actually, Dr. Pezeshkian, the new president, he was an MP from Tabriz. And he said this was the largest crowd that Tabriz has ever seen. And then the funeral in Tehran, it was massive, in the millions. And in Qom. And so after these 3 funerals, and there was still a couple more left, they called me, and I went on the BBC, and I said, you were talking about how people are celebrating. Do these look like celebrations? But I think that the 6 candidates who were standing for election and who were in the debates, and then in the second round, the 2 left, I think that, since we just lost President Raisi, I think a lot of people didn't see a President Raisi among these people. Now, maybe President Pezeshkian will be just as good, if not better. I hope so. But I think that a lot of people did not see any of those 6 candidates as having those characteristics that President Raisi had, rightly or wrong. That was a part of it too. But I also, if I want to be a spin doctor of sorts, I could also say that in the first round, the turnout was lower, but always in the second round, turnouts, the first round was the lowest, but in the second round, where turnouts are usually even lower, in Iran, it went up. So that is somewhat positive. But President Pezeshkian, he and this is also interesting. In the West, they always say how there's no democracy, everything is for show. It is the supreme leader, as they like to call him, even though we don't have such a term in Persian. But and so many in Iran say supreme leader because that's what they say in the West. But not in Persian.
By the way, I know that the Persian term is rahbar, which means guide, and or leader. But I checked because I was saying, well, what would be the equivalent term when I was writing the introduction? And I checked Ayatollah Khamenei's official website in English, and it uses the term supreme leader. So that's why I felt comfortable using it, even though it is a Western media term.
Well, he of course doesn't run his website. But yes, that's how it is. Even in the leader's office. I mean, that is how cultural influence works. And I think the term supreme leader is used like for North Korea. And I don't even know if that's what they use in North Korea. Someone would have to, put something in the comments, maybe someone from Korea. But I think they began using supreme leader to sort of say Iran is like North Korea. Anyway, so the elections in Iran. So sometimes, for example, in the West, they say the leader or the supreme leader has all the authority and the president is a figurehead. But I remember back in the day when Ahmadinejad was the president, they were saying that this guy is going to bring the world to an end. He's a danger and a threat to the world. Well, if he has no authority, then how is he a threat to the world? So one day the president has authority, the next day the president doesn't have authority. So depending on the interests that the Western media and the Western governments are pursuing. Iranian politics, the president is extremely powerful. And he is the second most important person in Iran. And with regards to day-to-day affairs, he is probably the most important person in Iran because he runs the government. So in strategic issues, second, but when it comes to day-to-day affairs, he is the person to go to. My university, the University of Tehran, it's a government university. It gets its funding from him. So he's the boss. But and there was diversity. They were talking about the hardliners and the reformists. So ultimately, when you have all these different views, that means there is some sort of democracy. Maybe not the fantastic sort of democracy like in the United States, where you have a choice between Hillary Clinton and Trump, or Biden and Trump, or Harris and Trump, that diverse, or Hillary, the husband, and Hillary's husband, and then Hillary Clinton, the wife, that sort of diverse choice that they have in American elections. We don't have that diversity here in Iran, true, but there are diverse opinions. But what I would say is that reformists and conservative, or as they call themselves, principalists in Iran, they are very different from one another. The reformists, the so-called reformists, are very diverse. And it's really not a very meaningful term. And the same is true with the conservative or principalists, as they say. They are very diverse. I would argue that President Pezeshkian and President Raisi were both staunch supporters of the Palestinian people, or were in the case of President Raisi. These two people are centrists. I don't mean centrist as in U.S. politics, but they're more to the center, and that they are the two. Though the two were from different camps, if you look at President Pezeshkian's statement, his first letter that was published in English in the Tehran Times newspaper a few weeks ago, his foreign policy is literally identical to that of President Raisi's. He says, my priority is building ties with those countries that stood with us during the sanctions, the height of the sanctions. And he named Russia and China. He said that expanding our role in BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, other such bodies, is my priority. the same as President Raisi. He said building ties with neighbors and the global South is my priority. It's the same as President Raisi. He said that I'm willing to pursue better ties with the West, such as and the Europeans, if they change their policies. That's what President Raisi also said. And that's why we had nuclear negotiations a couple of years ago, and we almost reached a deal. But then the Americans balked at the last stage. In Vienna, I was at the talks. I was the sort of unofficial media spokesman for the delegation. They reached an agreement back then. And even Joseph Borrell, the European Union foreign policy chief, he said that the Iranian demand at the end of the negotiations, the Iranian demands are reasonable, and the text that the Iranians provided with him after receiving it, the final Iranian text, he said the Iranian demands are reasonable. We hope the Americans accept it. I'm paraphrasing, and so we can move on. But the Americans didn't. It was near the midterm elections, and then after that, we had the riots in Iran. The Americans and the Western media believed their own propaganda, that the people hated the regime, as they like to call it, and that it was going to fall, and they lost that opportunity. Or they never wanted to sign an agreement. I don't know. But in any case, the policy of pursuing better relations with the West was pursued by President Raisi, and President Pezeshkian is willing to do the same under the same conditions, that the West changes its behavior. But when it comes to Palestine, the two are the same. Neither of them accepts the legitimacy of this regime. Neither of them will accept ethno-supremacism and ethnic cleansing in Palestine. The Zionist regime must come to an end. Judaism in its true form, not Zionism, alongside Islam in its true form, unlike, let's say, ISIS, and Christianity, you have the Nazis, they're not Christian. ISIS is not Muslim. Zionism is not Judaism. Palestine has to be a land where Muslims, Christians, and Jews live side by side as equal human beings. That's Iranian policy. That was Iranian policy under President Raisi, and that is Iranian policy under President Raisi and under President Pezeshkian. Sorry, it's 1:20. It's 1:17 a.m. So I'm talking a lot of nonsense. I hope there's nothing.
You're very clear, and we're keeping you up.
But Dr. Pezeshkian today, his cabinet got a vote of confidence, and I think it's the first time that in Iran, the parliament gave the president, all of his cabinet members, a vote of confidence. Usually 1, 2, 3, 4, they don't make it. And then he has to introduce new people later. But all of his and this is a parliament that is predominantly principlist or conservative. So I think right now there's a lot of solidarity and consensus in Iran with regards to the road ahead. So Iran is both diverse and dynamic with many problems. By no means do I claim that Iran is a utopia, but it is not the dystopia that the West likes it to be seen as. Iran is the only country, and I stress this, if we're talking about morality, it is the only country that is actively supporting the resistance to end apartheid. So when it comes to morality, no country in the West, in NATO, can speak about morality to the Islamic Republic of Iran. Of course, I consider Yemen to be a sovereign and independent country that also plays the same role, but Iran from decades ago was pursuing this course. The new government in Yemen has the same ideology, and the resistance in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, of course, have the same objectives and agenda. They want to bring an end to this situation. So Iran has many problems. There's corruption, there's incompetence, there are economic problems, there are social problems, there are all sorts of problems. But Iran is by no means an abnormal country. It's by no means a dystopia. And in my opinion, when it comes to Palestine, it is really, alongside the resilient people of Palestine itself and the axis of resistance, it is our hope.
Well, that's an upbeat note to leave the discussion on. We could talk to you all night, but we're gonna let you get some rest, and we know you have a busy schedule in Beijing, and we wanted to talk to you more about your visit to China, but perhaps we can do that soon on a future occasion, perhaps when you're back home in Tehran. And until then, we wish you a very good night and a very safe trip. And just to let people know who maybe are seeing you for the first time, although I think people know you, Dr. Marandi, you are just fantastic at explaining things so clearly. You're a great debater, as I said, and there's people who haven't got enough of you should go on YouTube and look you up and see you beating down Piers Morgan and other representatives.
Shills for empire, yeah.
Yeah, shills for empire, and they will get a real education just by listening to you as we have. So again, thank you so much for your time, and we hope to talk to you again very, very soon. And thank you for all the great insight.
Thank you, Dr. Moran.
Thank you very much for having me. Just one final point, and I think which is relevant. And the reason why I'm here is actually because of a conference that they're holding here, and it's on BRICS and the emerging multipolar world. So again, this is very much related to what we've been talking about, and what I'm sure you've been talking about often over the past few months. And that the West can no longer dictate terms of the world, and the world is changing. And BRICS is a sign of that. And there are other reasons to believe that the West can no longer control the world, and they cannot no longer control the narrative. So while I believe that the road ahead is going to be very difficult, but I think that thanks to the resistance, and when I mean the resistance, I mean everyone. You and Nora are the resistance. Your audience is the resistance. Those young Jewish, Muslim, Christian students who are on campus, they're the resistance. People across Europe who've been struggling for the Palestinian cause are the resistance. Across the global South, the resistance has grown, and the world is changing, and the political establishment in Western countries are increasingly isolated, and they're growing weaker every day. So I am very optimistic about the future. I recognize that, again, that the road ahead will be very sadly full of pain and sorrow, but ultimately the apartheid regime will fall.
We hope to celebrate that day soon.
Yes, absolutely.
Sure.
Thank you so much, Dr. Marandi.
Thank you.
Please take care and get some rest.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right.
Oh gosh, I'm really, really glad that worked out.
Yeah, always so informative and so lucid. And,
yeah.
Again, just so good. Dr. Marandi is so good at cutting through the Western propaganda. And you may agree with him or disagree with him on some things. That's fine. But it's so rare for us to be able to hear just an unfiltered view, and not filtered through American or Israeli propaganda. So I'm very glad that all connected and worked as we wanted it to.
Me too. Well, thank you. And you are watching and listening to the Electronic Intifada live stream. I'm Nora Barrows-Friedman with Ali Abunimah. Let's bring John on screen for
Hello,
the
friends.
report. Hello, John. How are you?
That was a great interview. I found myself laughing many times at how just cogent his presentation is. I'm devastated to hear about those Reuters sources not being in the Iranian regime. I wonder if that means the Hezbollah sources are not real too.
Well, as you know, John, Hezbollah only gives its exclusives to the right-wing neocon pro-Israeli Wall Street Journal.
Yeah.
So
those are
for the Atlantic, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Unreal. Well, it's been another busy week for you, John, and for the resistance fighters. Give us a sense of what you're going to be covering.
Yeah, we're going to cover an ambush in the Netzarim corridor, which is really interesting, done by new recruits. So that's an interesting detail. And then Hezbollah showed us for the first time their underground missile base, which is just something that I don't think Israel really wanted to see. So we'll show that. It's quite an interesting video.
Incredible. All right. Well, let's go for it.
Let's get into it. As usual, we're going to start in the south of the Gaza Strip. As Nora said in her excellent and devastating newscast, the targeting of schools is something that is happening consciously by the Israelis. The Israeli military is also reporting on targeting these schools. They're not covering it up. They've reported on more than 75 airstrikes in the last 2 months on schools. And so the military is claiming these and saying that they're Hamas command posts and whatever, but they're openly putting on record that they're targeting these civilian, the only place in Gaza for civilians to go. And as Nora said, people are pressed into 11% of the Gaza Strip, which is the number that the civil defense used a few days ago and the Israeli military used today, which is interesting that the Israeli military is using civil defense numbers for things like that. But when the casualties come, they cast aspersions on the casualty rates that we know are on undercount. So we're going to go from the south of the Gaza Strip to the north and the Netzarim corridor, which you can see here on this map of all of Gaza. And when we zoom in here on Rafah, we can see where the main battle space has been. And this is now 106 days into the Rafah invasion that was supposed to be a few weeks. The American administration is still not saying it's a full-scale invasion of Rafah, but the destruction along the Philadelphia corridor is what is important to note. And the Philadelphia corridor has, of course, come up significantly in the ceasefire negotiations, the fraudulent ceasefire negotiations, because Israel is now formally, through maps to their delegations, delivering maps to the delegation, their delegation delivering maps showing them remaining in the Philadelphia corridor. And the Philadelphia corridor didn't come out of nowhere. This is not something that popped up during this war. The Philadelphia corridor goes back to 1982. It goes back to the Israelis leaving the Sinai Peninsula and their peace agreement with Egypt and cutting Rafah, Egypt, and Rafah, Gaza in half. And splitting the territory. So this is something that goes back. This is a strategic corridor that Israel believes is necessary for cutting up the Gaza Strip. So the fact that it's in the news now and seems like it's something new, it's important to always note that this is not the case. There's a long history of battles in this area along the Philadelphia corridor, notably in 2001, the first tunnel operation dug underneath an IDF position on the Philadelphia corridor with 500 pounds of explosives using a tunnel to devastating effect in 2001. And then in 2004, when I was reporting from Rafah, there was a series of operations along the corridor that were tunnel dug under IDF positions along the corridor that essentially were part of the critical mass of operations of resistance that drove the Israelis out of Gaza. And Ariel Sharon at the time said, we had a dream, the dream to colonize Gaza, but the dream could not be implemented. And the dream could not be implemented because of the resistance in Gaza, because of the tunneling in Gaza. And that is what the Israelis have encountered since their May invasion of Rafah, is that there's tunnels all underneath the border, and the Israelis have said originally that it was going to be a weeks-long operation, and now the IDF talks about years to stay in this corridor. So that's their fantasy right now, is to stay in the Philadelphia corridor. So just wanted to bring attention to that because it's in the news now. But of course, listeners of this show, we've been tracking the Philadelphia corridor since the beginning of the Rafah invasion, and even before, knowing that it would be a strategic corridor that Israel is trying to fight along. So if we look and see Tel Sultan there in the west side, that's where the core of these operations are happening this week. And again, everything you're seeing this week is from the days since you saw me last. So yeah, let's go to number 1 tomorrow. This is an operation by the Qassam brigades against an Israeli position in a hospital. Also, we know that they bomb schools, bomb hospitals, and occupy the hospitals as well. This is an operation against the Indonesian hospital. You can see the thermobaric Iranian RPG-7 thermobaric warhead, and that's the North Korean F-7 fragmentation warhead that you're seeing there. Seeing fighters mouse holing again. These sophisticated types of operations, moving around between buildings without going outside. All these things we've seen since the beginning of the battle. You can see through those two sniper loopholes there, you can see the soldiers in a window. This is their loophole version, clearly marking their position. Again, the only curtain in the entire building, bombed out, destroyed Indonesian hospital. You can see it there. It's been rendered inoperative for many months. So this operation is, again, it's a Qassam Brigades operation. You can see the way that the thermobaric warhead just punches through that wall. And on the backside of the building, you can see the F-7. It was a combined strike, and we have the filming from a third position. So again, spotters all over these operations in multiple places. That's something you're going to see. And again, this operation was dedicated to Ismail Haniyeh, as all of the operations, many of the operations, almost all of the operations recently have been by all the factions. And there's the medevac again, untouched medevac. And you can see here at the end of this video that they're going to bring in fruit here in triangles, which is, again, the fighters in the battalions across Gaza communicating with each other, because we've seen that that started with the Tel Al-Hawa battalion when they got from the runner that picked up their video, when they got those desserts in triangles. And now all the other battalions are communicating with each other by doing the same thing. So interesting to note that, again, constant communication. There's nothing like people being trapped without communication. These fighters are publishing these videos on the same day in many cases that they're being executed, and they're able to communicate with each other. Command and control is still intact in all of the important ways. Of course, the war is devastating. It's devastating for everybody. It's costly on the resistance. It's costly on the Israelis. But there's nothing like dismantling the 4 battalions in Rafah that's going on here. In fact, the Israelis have limited their operations in the town of Rafah down mostly to the corridor, which is why we see this fighting in Tel Sultan, which is a built-up area along the corridor. And the fighters say at the end here, the one fighter says that one of the fighters brought us a basket of fruits as a treat so that they may rejoice in the victory of this operation. And the sign says that you're going to see coming up, the sign says to, it shouts out the other, the Tel Al-Hawa battalion that used the triangles, the Khan Yunis battalion that did it as well. And then there was the pizza in the Tel Sultan in the western edge, and these fighters praying after their operation. And on the sign says Rafa Brigade, Western Battalion, Tel Sultan. So the fighters, again, want to identify where they're from, marking the battle space, giving us in these videos the kind of reporting that we would just never get otherwise. And their media operations has been a critical part of this media strategy throughout the war to show the world that Israel's losing. Like Dr. Morandi said, the fighters themselves broadcasting these images have played a key role in that. So that is continuing apace this week. If we look at number 2, this is a 𝐓𝐡𝐞 𝐄𝐥𝐞𝐜 operation, RPG-7 operation. We see a D9 armored bulldozer, Namr troop carrier, and Merkava tank operating together. Again, this is in Tel Sultan, the main battle space. Those close quarters battles, 15 Yasin strikes just in the last week in this area. The fighters identifying here in the volume that we cut out that hit the tank, and the fighters are going to move to a second location here. And the one fighter says to the other, he says, "We destroyed it." And the other fighter says, "Let's do another. We succeeded in the first. We'll probably succeed in the second too. God is generous." They're just laughing at each other. And part of this operation, the joy of their resistance, and their fighting back. Obviously, a key part of this genocide is the resistance that has been carried out by the fighters, but also by the people themselves that Nora covers every week in her newscast. Just the resistance of all elements, from the children are in many ways the most fierce resistors are the children. And in this operation here, you can hear when they're moving between the buildings, you can hear machine gun fire from the tank mounted machine gun. So we're not looking at pot shots that are being taken here. This is right in the core of the battle space that's happening, an operation again. And this operation was dedicated by 𝐓𝐡𝐞 𝐄𝐥𝐞𝐜. You can see the towing, D9 bulldozer here towing the Namr troop carrier. So it's a mobility kill, somewhat surprising with the RPG-7. It's not a tandem charge round that 𝐓𝐡𝐞 was firing there, but it immobilized the tank. Mobility kill is something that is also a very strategic, it's a tactical victory with strategic implications, because the damaging of the tanks, they take time to fix. They're out of battle. It stretches Israel's resources further. And so we're seeing that consistently throughout these battles. We're wondering, it's fair to wonder how they're going to fight a war in Lebanon that they're promising when they're, again, as Dr. Morandi said, unable to handle this small area in the Gaza Strip where people have been trapped for decades without access to the outside world. If we look at number 5 here tomorrow, we'll go to Khan Yunis. This is just I brought this one because it's ingenuity here. This is a different type of operation than we've seen. This is 𝐓𝐡𝐞 𝐄𝐥𝐞𝐜. They're calling this an Ababil. What it is just a rocket-assisted guerrilla action device. The device we've seen the fighters place by hand under the turrets of tanks. Here, where in Khan Yunis, where there's a command post here, and the Israelis are staying mostly on the edges, and they're unable to reach the resistance's. Isn't able to reach them with their close quarters weaponry. They're here mounting up an improvised rocket-assisted munition and firing it at the Israeli position. Again, these are fragmentation weapons that explode. They're for an area. They cover an area, so they don't need to be as accurate. But you can see they use the same principles as the mortar and rocket teams. You can see the measuring and putting into the ground into these makeshift launchers at the proper coordinates to fire, and then they fire simultaneously, which is also an asset. And also, just to note in this video, we're seeing it from 3 different angles. Again, spotters all over Able. We're showing here in the upper corner, it says camera 1. You're going to see camera 2 and camera 3. And those cameras aren't just for filming the operation. Those spotters are positioned around the city. That's part of the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance that's happening constantly, and the reason why the resistance always has the upper hand on these Israeli movements, because they have these spotters in these positions. So they're not deploying these spotters just to take video of their operation. These spotters are in place and taking the video as part of that. So let's look at number 6, because another ingenuity, we see a makeshift suicide drone here, an armed explosive laden drone. You can see it's a styrofoam and it works. And they launched this drone in Khan Yunis along with a first-person view camera, an analog camera that you're going to see here. This is the first of its kind that we've seen in Gaza with a camera like this on a makeshift drone that could be deployed by an engineer in Gaza who has the time. The war has lasted long enough to be carrying out operations like this, where the engineers have time to operate with the little resources that they have right now in certain circumstances and do it successfully. And we can watch this armed drone. They're putting the fuse in it. And the fighter says that this drone attack will bring inevitable death. It targeted the house of the enemy soldiers that are fortified. So the Israeli military taking up positions inside houses, which is something they do constantly. And you can see the FPV, the first-person view of this drone. Just, remarkable ingenuity in the most difficult circumstances, pretty much that humans can imagine is going on right now in Gaza. And the resistance still carrying out operations like this. So I just wanted to bring you those two just to show you how they're able to do that in the middle of the battle. And let's look at number 7, Tamar, because this is actually from the beginning of the war. This is the Zuari drones. Mohammed Zuari was the founder of the Qassam drone program. He was assassinated in Tunisia in 2016. And this is from October 7th. These videos were released. I haven't showed you guys these videos yet. The drones always get bumped by having so much material to cover each week. So we haven't shown these, but these drones, these Zuari drones, suicide drones, one-way attack drones, armed drones, were a key part of the October 7th operation. They were part of the blinding operation, the cover fire for the blinding operation that dropped the communications for the Gaza division. And you can see this drone program has been in place for many years, but we had never seen it on this scale before. During the 2014 war, the first drone was sent during the 2014 war, and Israel shot it down with a Patriot missile, which is $1 billion plus battery and a multi-million-dollar missile. Shooting down a drone in 2014. The drone program accelerated between 2014 and now, and on October 7th, there was more than 36 of these fired simultaneously during that operation on October 7th. So just wanted to show those drones. They haven't made it in there, the Zuari drones. Again, ingenuity inside Gaza, under siege, building these weapons themselves from scratch. Has been happening with everything from hand grenades now all the way through to an air force. And we saw in that video that we just watched, the Qassam fighter had an air force patch on his sleeve there, showing that they have an air wing division as well. So major developments that are happening under the most brutal circumstances. If we look at map C here tomorrow, we'll go to the north. We're going to focus in on Tel Al-Hawa there in the southwestern edge of Gaza City. Tel Al-Hawa has been in these reports for months now, fighting valiantly as everything around them is being destroyed. And the Netzarim corridor is, again, it's a key corridor like the Philadelphia corridor that didn't just come out of this war. This is one of the fingers that Ariel Sharon planned for Gaza from the 1970s. To put these positions to put civilian positions in, to make them military installations and make them justifiable by using human shields, using civilians as they do in the Gaza envelope. They did that in the Netzarim corridor too. And because of that, Netzarim corridor has been a site of struggle. It was a site of struggle in the first Intifada, in the second Intifada. In many ways, the spreading of the second Intifada from the Al-Aqsa mosque throughout Palestine was with the murder of Mohammed al-Dura, the young boy who was killed in the Netzarim junction on international television, and really was the spark that really carried out the Intifada that would then last for 4.5 years or so until the Israelis left the Gaza Strip. So successful operations during that period, during the Second Intifada, resistance along the corridor, everything from kids throwing stones to the more qualitative operations of the Qassam brigades at the time, made it impossible for Israel to be in Gaza. So when they come back to Gaza in 2023, 2024, they're taking back these positions that they had strategically used for decades before. And we predicted that that would happen early on in this show, because that's the way the whole of the Gaza Strip is set up. The concentrations of population are trapped in in between what used to be Israeli settlements, and those settlements cut off each area of Gaza and made it more manageable for military operations. And that's what we're seeing now, why the Israelis don't want to leave the corridors in these ceasefire negotiations, because they want to divide up the Gaza Strip. And in the face of the defeat that they are experiencing here, to hold on to these two pieces of territory so that they can continue the war indefinitely is their plan. As we know, the ceasefire negotiations critically involve a clause to resume the war. So not really ceasefire negotiations at all. So this is in the Netzarim corridor. I wanted to set this operation up because this is an operation by Qassam number 10 here tomorrow, behind enemy lines. Fighters were able to penetrate into the corridor. We see them. This is the editing of these videos, which is another thing that's improved throughout this war. They're making incredible video edits here. They have a sizzle reel that starts this operation, which is the Corridor of Death operation. They're showing here the Al-Bara Mosque. We remember the Al-Bara Mosque 5-stage ambush from a week or two ago. And it's saying on the screen that a group of 4 fighters was able to enter the Netzarim axis, in which dozens of soldiers were present. They raided an enemy force, detonated 2 anti-personnel explosives versus 2 jeeps. And so these fighters are able to get behind enemy lines here. We haven't seen an operation of this type, but this is the kind of operation that they'll expect if they hold in these corridors, just like in 2004 in the Philadelphia corridor. The operations in the Philadelphia corridor develop the longer the Israelis are there. So we see these fighters moving into position. And it's key to note here that these are new recruits. The fighter's going to tell us right here. He says, "We are the Qassam Brigade's 2024 recruits. The recruiting class of 2024 will be a horror for the entity, something unlike they've never seen before. Today, we dedicate this operation to the soul of our martyr, Ismail Haniyeh, and the soul of all of our martyrs." So that's a fighter who was not in Qassam until this year. These 4 fighters, it seems, are new recruits carrying out this operation, which is a devastating operation, psychologically devastating operation for the Israelis, because you can see here they're targeting a supply route that the Israelis feel very comfortable on. We see the fighters here wiring up the 2 anti-personnel devices, the television and the Radia, the Qassam built anti-personnel improvised explosive devices. You can see the fighters setting it up here. So they're on this supply corridor that the Israelis feel so comfortable at this point on this corridor that they're driving in soft-skinned vehicles. We saw that truck there. We're going to see jeeps be targeted, as you saw from the sizzle reel, and you can see a pickup truck in the middle. So there's the 2 explosive devices ready to meet this convoy. These 2 jeeps here, these 2 Hummers, are going to be the target of it. And we have a spotter in the window and the fighters in a separate building. So we have 4 fighters in 2 buildings spread out, 1 camera person right in the front to capture that operation, detonated expertly. This operation was carried out extremely well. So for the fact that they're including new recruits, I mean, I think there's a lot to say about that. But to carry out an operation of this style and quality, the Israelis admitted 2 dead, one in each of these 2 jeeps that were hit, that we're seeing here. The use of new recruits is something that, of course, we expected. There's an entire generation of youth watching these fighters in their minds heroically defend their homeland. and people want to join. People want to fight. And people who aren't teenagers, who are not in the Qassam brigades before and have had their lives wiped out, their jobs destroyed, their families killed, living in tents. Of course, there's going to be recruits there's going to be more recruits than fighters lost by an order of magnitude, which is something we've expected all along. But to see this in this way in the Netzarim corridor with a qualitative operation like this is just very significant operation. You can see the Israelis, again, they get a free pass on their wounded soldiers. The Prophet says not to attack wounded soldiers, and wounded soldiers do not get attacked. Let's look at it one more time tomorrow because it's such an excellent operation. So you can see it starts here with the sizzle reel. So the editing is impressive. You can see the multi-stage use of the corridor supply route. You can see an attack helicopter in the air. We're going to see tactical drone footage again being used here. If we look on this, I'm going to pay more attention to these triangles that they're showing you, because they're showing you important things. The University College of Applied Sciences, the engineering university is going to be shown here. They're up on the left, and you can see it's just wasted, which is just really devastating to see these universities when you see them in this way. So you can see the ambush zone there and the supply route from drones. So tactical deployment of drones consistently, which is something that has been increasing as the war has gone on. We didn't see that too much early on in the war, but lately, in the last couple of months, we're seeing tactical drone deployments in all of these crucial ambush operations that are being planned. So this is footage of fighters getting behind enemy lines here. And this, again, is the fighter saying that he is a new recruit. And they put that cut into the video. And there's, I think, maybe in the discussion we could talk about that, what it says that they did that, because they obviously choose to let people know this. They choose to let the Israelis know, and this is their way of communicating with the world. So they could have left that detail out, that they were new recruits, because there's nothing in this operation that would indicate they're new recruits. They're skillful fighters. But you can see the type of vehicles on this supply route. To choose this supply route is a qualitative operation. The Netzarim corridor is under standoff fire, rocket and artillery, mortars constantly. But this is the first time we've seen fighters penetrate into the corridor. And as long as the Israelis stay in this corridor, this is the type of operations that they're going to be subjected to. So the resistance has a say. When the Israelis say, we're staying in the Netzarim corridor, or we're staying in the Philadelphia corridor, the resistance gets a vote on that as well. The Israelis can't just decide these things, because the cost to the Israelis to be in these areas is raised by the resistance. And once the Israelis pull out of the other areas of Gaza and leave themselves just in the buffer zone and in the corridors, they're more susceptible to these operations, obviously, the longer the battle goes on. And that Jeep is just accelerating there into the berm. And the second Jeep you're seeing here get hit. So both the IEDs, the Radia is a unidirectional IED, and the television is omnidirectional. So they use both anti-personnel weapons. They didn't. Normally, you'd think they would use a Shawad EFP, but because they're soft-skinned vehicles here, they're, again, choosing the appropriate weapon for the operation. It made more sense to use an anti-personnel weapon, because these vehicles are not up-armored vehicles. And so they're choosing the right weapon. They're not using just what they have. And it worked to devastating effect. And here's the fighters. Actually, I didn't mention this the first time around, but you would hear it if the audio is in. But these fighters fire on the immediate aftermath of the ambush. So you can see that they're in position to fire on the evacuation of the wounded troops with, like, there's something like 16 Israelis in that scene with the troops. And they don't target them. I know a lot of people in the comments question that decision. It's something that they're standing on principle. Look at that. I mean, they're within, the fighters are still within that corridor, and you've got just a whole gaggle of soldiers carrying stretchers there. So impressive operation in the Netzarim corridor. And 𝐄𝐿 did number 11 here tomorrow. 𝐿 put out a poster here, which links in why I did the introduction to the Netzarim corridors, because this is a telling poster that 𝐿 put out that quotes Abu Ubaidah, the spokesperson for 𝐿, on July 7th, saying that Netzarim will be a corridor of death and terror for the enemy occupying soldiers. The enemy will emerge defeated as they did before in Gaza, driven out of these corridors. But also, just a small note here, it's that sign is into a helmet, but Netzarim corridor checkpoint, when it began, that's what it looked like. There was a sign and it was a tire. This is what checkpoints looked like when I got to Palestine at the beginning, in the Second Intifada, before they built the wall. Many of the checkpoints were just signs in concrete in a tire, like a tire. They fill it up with concrete, put a signpost. So there's layers to these resistance media communications, and this poster is one of those layers, because it's referring back to Abu Ubaidah threatening the corridor. It's hearkening back to, well, the operation, because you can see the Jeep in the background. So it's specific to that operation. But then it's got that signpost that everyone in Gaza knows, because you couldn't get through Gaza without going through the Netzarim corridor. And the Netzarim junction was a checkpoint that was hell for Palestinians. So just this kind of communication with the outside world, with Gazans, with the international community, with each other, all going on consistently. And now with number 12, we have this video took some time to release. This is from last month's battle in Shuja'iyah. And it's a joint operation, 𝐿 and Saraya al-Quds. You see the fighters here with two Yasin 105s. They're talking about the operation as they're loading up and heading out. You're going to see two armored vehicles, and this is going to be a twin strike. These fighters are both going to fire at the same time and fire accurately at the same time. Sometimes these videos come out after, especially from Shuja'iyah. The operational security in the Battle of Shuja'iyah was such that, if we remember back, 𝐿 released all their videos after the main invasion, the second invasion of Shuja'iyah. So the fighters are coming out here, and the one fighter says, he says, "Be careful of the drones." He says, "Stay near the wall. Be careful of the drones." The first fighter is going to pop out and fire, and you can see the two armored vehicles right there. A twin operation. If you fire two at the same vehicle, they're an even more potent weapon, because the armor is pierced by the first round. And then these fighters are going to go back, and the audio's not in. If you want to go to my Twitter to check out the uncensored version, these fighters, the joy in their voice, and as they return to their base safely, the joy of their operation, just the depths of what they've gone through for the last 11 months, it just oozes out when they carry out this operation, as they both drop to the floor, crying and praying. It's just a really potent video here that came from Shuja'iyah from last month that I just wanted to bring to show. They released it this week. It's not from July. They released that video this week, but it's from the battle in July. So that is the Gaza Strip resistance report. But I want to show you the recent news from Lebanon, which is Hezbollah releasing a video. Just give me 1 second here, tomorrow. Releasing a video of their underground bunkers, which is something that should be seen as part of these psychological operations that Hezbollah has taken on the Israelis. We've seen, it should be seen with the 3 drone operations, the drone operation over Haifa that showed that they could fly over Haifa for hours over multiple days. They did the same kind of video over the occupied Golan Heights. And then more recently, they did it over the Ramat David Air Base in the north, showing that they have the intelligence. Those videos I showed you, those videos, they're super detailed. They knew what every installation, exactly what company, what battalion, what brigade was in, what squadron was where, which facilities were used for testing, which ones were barracks. They knew everything about it. And so this video that we're going to see here is really part of that. And this week, Defense Minister Gallant was up in the north, and he was saying to the Israeli soldiers in the north that the center of gravity is moving from the south to the north, implying again, as they have been, that a war on Hezbollah, a war on Lebanon, is necessary to change the strategic outlook of Israel, where there's a buffer zones. The buffer zones are inside Israel. We've talked about this for the whole war. The buffer zones for the first time are inside Israel, both in the south in the Gaza envelope, but particularly in the north, where something like 40 settlements have been abandoned, and the Israeli military is pushed off the border by 10 kilometers. So an invasion of Lebanon requires the Israelis to retake land in their own country before they're going to Lebanon, which is just a strategic situation that they've never faced before. And again, we're going to look at this in the context of the assassination of Fouad Shukr, who was the strategic commander for the rocket and missile program. And after the war in 2006, Shukr saw the military buildup and expansion of Hezbollah from a rocket force that had 15,000 rockets at the time, half of which were destroyed or fired during the 2006 war, to now Israeli estimates have it at 200,000 rockets, plus a precision guidance program that Hezbollah undertook to make their rockets missiles, which has been going on now for more than a decade. So with that in mind, let's take a look at video 25 tomorrow, because this is just a remarkable video. We've seen the tunnels under Gaza built in clay and sand. These tunnels built in Lebanon are built in stone. They're built in the mountains. They're extremely fortified. As we know, the Gaza ones are too. The Israelis can't reach them with airstrikes. But this is the first time we have seen these underground facilities in this way. We've seen the bunkers in 2006. The underground played a key role in the July war in 2006. But this is next level, what they're showing us. It's something that we knew existed, but to see it on this level, and to show for Hezbollah to show this psychological operation in this moment, as war, as Dr. Morandi said, feels like a response is imminent at any point here. This is a Nasrallah speech that's happening in the background that says the resistance in Lebanon has in its possession the weapons, equipment, and capabilities, and its fighters have the ability, expertise, and experience, and the faith, determination, courage, and will. And we are as stronger at any point than in our history. And also, this is in total secrecy underground. But you can see the size of this underground network on the walls. There's Abbas Musawi, who is the assassinated Secretary General of Hezbollah, who was before Nasrallah. He was assassinated in 1992. Picture of Nasrallah, picture of Qasem Soleimani, who was the Quds Force General, assassinated in 2020. And then this facility is called the Imad 4, named after Imad Mughniya, whose poster you saw there, the critical commander of Hezbollah, who was assassinated in Syria in 2008. So these assassinations, they hurt the organization, but it doesn't change the trajectory. The builders, Fouad Shukr, who is responsible for this, assassinated in Beirut a few weeks back. This is the product of his work. And you can see the assassination of Fouad Shukr is not going to change the trajectory of this operation. We're seeing this massive underground bunker system, tunnel network connecting to all of these hidden launch pads for the 200,000 rockets and missiles. You can see the size of it with these trucks. These trucks, Hezbollah doesn't show us what missiles are on these trucks. That's not the important part of this video. The important part of the video is that once you have truck launched, once you have capability to truck launch, you can launch everything in Hezbollah's arsenal. Particularly the Fatah 110s are the ones the Israelis are most concerned about. As a weapon, they carry heavy payloads and are precision guided. And they will, what you're seeing here, join up with the intelligence and the drones over Haifa and over the military, the Air Force base, Ramat David. And you put those 2-3 videos together with this video, and you see the psychological operations coming together, showing how they have the coordinates that are necessary. They're demonstrating that they have the ability necessary. And this is what it is. This is the launch site. This is effectively a mobile missile silo where the truck can run in, drive into this silo, open up the doors that are, you can see there, are covered by camouflage, by trees or by netting, and are able to fire. The doors are able to be closed, and they can't be return striked. They can't be taken out by follow-up strikes, which means that Hezbollah maintains the ability of second strike capability. So no matter what Israel does, Hezbollah has the opportunity to strike back. And that is just, so that's Nasrallah saying, the resistance now possesses rockets and precision-guided missile capabilities such that if Israel imposes war on Lebanon, it will face a fate beyond that which it could imagine at any point in its history, a war which will envelop all of Israel, he says Palestine, from the Lebanese border to the tip of Jordan at the Red Sea, from Kiryat Shmona to Eilat. And so that is that operation. Let's look at it one more time tomorrow, just because it's so remarkable what we're looking at. The thing that we don't know about this, they did show the trucks. And if you notice the detail on the trucks, well, first of all, the detail is this is the Ahmad 4 facility, implying there's other facilities. The Israelis know about tunnels that go into the Galilee. The Israelis have been on top of that for a while because the settlements, the settlers in the north have been terrified about this since the 2006 war. And there's a lot of stories in Israel about them panicking, saying they hear noises in the drains, they can hear digging, they can hear excavators working. And the IDF had to go up to the north and try to calm people's fears by sticking poles into the ground to see if they could find these tunnels. But these tunnels are below all of that. And unlike Gaza, where you have clay and sand and you need to deal with those as engineering problems, this is a completely different engineering project because you're going into solid stone. This video is called "Our Mountains Are Our Treasures." And so the idea is, they don't say where this one is, but these missile facilities would be likely be in the Baalbek, in the Bekaa Valley, in South Lebanon and in Beirut. And the question would be, like it is in Gaza, do they connect all together, this network? How big is this network? How many launch pads are in this network? And the launch pad capability, when you're talking about 200,000 rockets and missiles, this is just far beyond anything that Israel could handle. It's far beyond the Iron Dome, far beyond their aerial defense array, missile defense array. It's just on an orders of magnitude beyond that. The 2006 war was 150 rockets a day. Israeli planners are talking about 4,000 a day. Right from the beginning of the war. And that's the number that were fired out of Gaza on October 7th. That's a number in one day that is more than the entire 2016 war. And so we have scale. This has been scaled up by Hezbollah, who now have somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 fighters. And Nasrallah laughs about it because he says he has way more fighters and more people who want to be fighters than they can deploy. And they also have in terms of a regional war, allies in Iraq and Syria and Yemen and Iran who are willing to fight this. So this regional battle that Dr. Morandi was talking about has the possibility to be devastating. And that's why Hezbollah is careful with this. And that's why Iran is careful with this. And I think Dr. Morandi's point is well made, but you can see how many trucks there are here. And these trucks are numbered 14. I don't know if I pointed that out yet. The one truck was 14, one was 13. So again, just subtle indications that there's a lot of these. And you can see how able they are to move through these tunnels. The tunnel is just a massive underground space and gives the rocket capacity, missile capacity to saturate all over Israel, to target Israel in a way that has never happened before, as Nasrallah is saying right now in this video. You could see the way that the launch pads are camouflaged on the outside as well. So they open from a hole and you have mobile missile silos. It's a strategic reality that other countries, nation states don't have. Countries have missile silos that are individual silos, but the ability to drive underground and restock these firing positions, to have all your fighters already. This is the implication is already from 2006 that they're bunkered, that these tunnels are bunker positions for fighters. They have everything that they need in it for logistics, barracks, weapons caches, movement around. And in the 2006 war, they would pop up inside the same house as the Israelis were in and fight from upstairs to downstairs, psychologically tormenting the Israelis. They've been thinking about that ever since because of how devastating that was. So Hezbollah just really showing us with this psychological operation what they have, just a little sliver. What's hidden is greater, as they say. But just an idea of what they're capable of in a war with Israel. And I just wanted to show you one more, which is on the opposite end of the spectrum here. This is a quadcopter drone, one of 2,500 Hezbollah operations. They've been constant all week this week. You can see this is previous damage to this signals base. You can see on the left there that radar dome is completely destroyed. But they're using a quadcopter or a hexacopter here, an explosive laden one, flying it right up to this key surveillance and communications tower. And then watch what they do with the steering here. They're going to drive it right in and hit the cables that connect the entire tower. So rather than striking the tower, they're going in with a quadcopter drone and detonating it along the core of this cables that basically shuts down this entire operation. So they have from the most sophisticated underground missile silo. In the same week, they released this video that just shows the slow and steady degrading of Israel's aerial defense capacity, and that were a war to happen, we'll see the result of the taking down of this technical gear. There's been more than 500 operations against technical gear, knocking out Israel's communications. So that is the resistance report from the south of Gaza to the Lebanon border, and a few remarkable operations this week, carrying on apace.
Wow, John. I mean, just the first part of it where, drones, I mean, just incredible drone capabilities. And then finishing up with that Hezbollah tunnel.
Tunnel's wild. That tunnel.
And it reminds me, we caught those glimpses relatively early in the war, apparently from video captured by the Israelis showing, I don't know if it was Mohammed Deif or his brother driving through a tunnel under Gaza.
Yeah.
And we still haven't, since then, we haven't seen anything like that, which indicates to us that what is hidden under Gaza is also more than what's seen, and that the Israelis haven't since then reached any of it. So if they're not even getting to this stuff under Gaza, which they have completely surrounded by land, sea, and air, and half their army, and how are they? And the earth in Gaza is soft. That's beach. That's soft ground, whereas Lebanon, South Lebanon, is rock and it's mountainous. It's a very different terrain to Gaza. And you don't have to go there to know that, but I've been to both of them, and it's very clear. So it's just it's just an incredible signal to Israel that, you could send your entire army and all your tanks into Lebanon, it's not going to make a difference.
Yeah.
No, the missiles are going to rain down on Israel, all over Israel. And that's the message.
Yeah, the video is really remarkable. I found that just so striking. Every time we've had people on, experts on, to discuss Lebanon, and this is a point you always make as well, John, when we've had Amal Said on as well on the podcast in the past, everyone has always made the point that the level of development of the resistance in Lebanon is, qualitatively much higher than the Palestinian resistance. But it's just something else to see that the reality of this latest video, very slickly done, and really good sort of production values. It's very clearly, as you said, like it's a message to the enemy that we have the capabilities, we have the infrastructure, and it's absolutely huge. Tunnels doesn't really do it justice.
I know what word to use for it.
Yeah.
Couldn't figure out what was the best word to describe that. It's like it's an underground city, and
it's an underground military complex, is what it is.
And I would bet that there are very few conventional militaries in the world that have anything like it.
No, there's no.
Yeah.
There's not.
That's a good point. I was trying to think of a comparison, but you can't really.
There's not really.
It's astonishing.
Yeah.
Well, certainly, that's something we're going to be watching very closely. Thanks for that again, John. We have a few discussion topics that we're going to get into for the rest of this program. Unfortunately, we do have to cover the Democratic National Convention. So let's do that. Right now, the Democratic Party is holding its convention in Chicago to formally nominate Kamala Harris. On Monday, some 20,000 people protested outside, demanding an end to U.S. arms shipments to Israel, and an even bigger protests are expected today and on Thursday, when Harris is set to give her acceptance speech. On Monday, the Democratic National Committee unveiled its 2024 platform. The policies it sets in support of Israel effectively reaffirm the party's support for the genocide, and they are a slap in the face to the party's voters, the majority of whom think that there should be an end to this genocide. Back in March, a national YouGov poll, one of many with similar findings, found that a majority of Americans agreed with the statement: the U.S. should stop weapon shipments to Israel until Israel discontinues its attacks on the people of Gaza. Among Democrats, the number who wanted an arms embargo rose to almost 2/3. Just 14% of Democrats disagreed. But of course, none of that is being reflected in what's happening on the convention stage in Chicago or in the platform itself. Ali, why don't you take us through some of the key points? And you were recently on Rania Khalek's program on Breakthrough News, going through more of this in detail. But take us through what this means.
Yeah, I would love to. But just before we do that, I just want to give an update for those who aren't following it closely. Last week, we had Hatem Aboudiya from the March on the DNC Coalition, and he was absolutely fantastic. And the organizing in Chicago has been incredible. I haven't been able to go to any of the protests yet, but some of our colleagues have. And I just want to say, when we spoke to Hatem last week, they were waiting for the city to issue the permits. And they did so that night after we spoke to Hatem, and the city tried to impose severe restrictions on the protests, banning a stage, banning amplification, banning portable toilets, banning all the things you need to have an effective protest and a safe gathering of so many people. And because of this strength of the organizing, when the coalition threatened to go to court, the city backed down. So I just, again, the message that Hatem was giving us is that organizing works. And so that's just to encourage people. But back to what's happening inside the convention hall. And we have just one of the things that's just so striking. The first page of the Democratic Party platform, and it's a 90-page document. You can find it online if you really must. But it starts with a land acknowledgement, and that's a statement honoring the indigenous people who lived on the land of Chicago and the surrounding area before the ethnic cleansing and genocide by the European settlers who founded the United States. And as you can see, they say, quote, "We honor the communities native to this continent and recognize that our country was built on indigenous homelands. We pay our respects to the millions of indigenous people throughout history who've protected our lands, waters, and animals." I just have to point out,
cynical.
Yeah, the shamelessness of a party pretending to care about indigenous rights while it is actively assisting ethnic cleansing and genocide in Palestine. And of course, by the way, indigenous people in this country are still having to struggle, and in Canada, of course, across North America, for their rights against both Democratic and Republican administrations, and in Canada against the Liberal government, which is so good at shedding crocodile tears about reconciliation. While who was it who once called Canada is three mining companies standing on each other's shoulders in a trench coat? So anyway, but I did a quick word count, and speaking of Canada, in the Democratic Party platform, Canada is mentioned precisely once. Mexico is mentioned 8 times. Of course, those are the two direct neighbors of the United States and among its biggest and most important trading partners. Russia, which the United States has decided it wants as an enemy, is mentioned 15 times. Israel is mentioned 29 times. Why is the Democratic Party unfairly singling out Israel to mention it so many times in its platform? Very strange. Now, there are about 5 pages covering what the party's policies are on what it calls the Middle East and North Africa. And overall, I would characterize it as extremely militaristic and warmongering. Neocon is what I called it on Rania Khalek's show, and I'll repeat that here. And I'll say more about that. But I want to talk about how it really is absolutely anti-Palestinian, directly anti-Palestinian. And so if we look at the next excerpt there, it has a whole section on October 7th, and this is just a bit of it. It says, President Biden and Vice President Harris have unequivocally denounced Hamas's brutal attack on Israel on October 7th, condemned the gruesome violence, including conflict-related sexual violence demonstrated by Hamas, and made clear that the United States wants to see Hamas defeated. So notice the words there: brutal, gruesome. And something interesting here. Kamala Harris, we've talked about this previously, has been part of spreading the October 7th rape hoax, which we've now debunked I don't know how many times on this program. And there is still not a single identified credible case of rape occurring on October 7th. And this is genocidal atrocity propaganda. But something interesting here, they don't use the word rape. Now, they use this term conflict-related sexual violence. And again, we've discussed this previously when we discussed the UN report by Pramila Patten that, again, found no corroboration of Israel's rape claims at all. And the UN uses the term conflict-related sexual violence. It's a really vague and broad term that encompasses all sorts of things. For example, it includes videos taken by Hamas fighters which show women wearing revealing clothing. The UN considers that to be conflict-related sexual violence. The important thing here is it doesn't mean rape. It could include rape, but it is not rape. Conflict-related sexual violence is far broader and vaguer. So what I think happened here, this is just my speculation, is that the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, wrote this, said, how can we continue to spread this genocidal propaganda without saying the word rape? And I think that's a recognition by them that actually the evidence isn't there and that we have really destroyed this narrative. But, perhaps casual or less informed readers won't make that distinction between rape and the term they use here. And they do use the word rape elsewhere in the platform, talking about what they're doing for victims of rape in the United States and so on, as part of their agenda, unrelated to October 7th. So it's not as if they're not willing to use the word rape, but they specifically didn't use it in this context. And I think that's notable. Now, by contrast, with this demonization of Palestinians and the continued spreading of Israeli atrocity propaganda, there's not one single statement in the platform that holds Israel responsible for anything bad. Look at this language. We can go to the next slide. That gives us some sense of, hang on, I'm on my wrong tab there. So you can see that they talk about the immense civilian pain and extreme suffering being caused by the conflict, including the displacement and death of so many innocent people in Gaza. And then they say many vulnerable civilians are suffering deadly consequences of the Israel-Hamas war. Residents of Gaza have been displaced and food security has been severe. And what you notice there is that these statements are either in the passive voice or, we have no idea who's doing all these terrible things.
It's a natural disaster. It's just naturally occurring famine and displacement. Yeah.
Exactly. So, and there's more of that, but I'm just, giving you examples here. So the Democrats are telling us here that they are not the party or the government that is going to hold Israel accountable or stop Israel from doing these crimes. Because if they're not willing to even say that Israel is doing them, they're certainly not willing to act on that. So it's very notable, that contrast. Now, let's look briefly at the Democrats' broader regional policies. And this is a slightly awkward screenshot because it's over across 2 pages. But they brag about the Biden administration, or let's call it the Biden-Harris administration, because they really want to emphasize that Kamala Harris can take credit for Joe Biden's supposed achievements. They talk about how Biden has authorized precision airstrikes on key Iranian-linked targets. Then they say President Biden ordered military strikes alongside allies against Houthi targets, that's against Yemen. And they brag about and Yemen, of course, is trying to stop a genocide. So they're bragging about bombing people and punishing them for the crime of trying to stop a genocide. And they brag about leading a coalition of countries to defend Israel. We talked about that with Dr. Marandi. From Iran's retaliation in April for the bombing of the Iranian consulate in Damascus. So they're trying to guarantee Israel's ability to continue the genocide and carry out its crimes with impunity. So that's what the Democrats are bragging about. And the next thing, we can move to the next slide, is really, truly incredible, because they want to draw a contrast. They say, we're bombing here, we're bombing there, we're sending billions to Israel, we're defending Israel so that it can continue to commit genocide. And they say, all this stands in sharp contrast to Trump's fecklessness and weakness in the face of Iranian aggression during his presidency. So the Democrats want you to know that they are the more warmongering party. And this is just astonishing. They say here, in January 2020, when Iran, for the first and only time in its history, directly launched ballistic missiles against U.S. troops in Western Iraq, Trump mocked the resulting traumatic brain injuries suffered by dozens of American service members as mere headaches, and again took no action. I have a question for the class. What's missing from this paragraph? Anyone remember what Iran fired missiles at U.S. bases for in January 2020?
Qasem Soleimani assassination?
Exactly.
Could it be?
Exactly, yeah.
Could it be that the U.S. assassinated a top military commander of a different country? Yeah.
Exactly. So they leave that out because Donald Trump ordered the assassination of Qasem Soleimani while he was in Iraq. So this is a very Israel-like operation. If you think about the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh in Iran, but it was ordered by Donald Trump, and he murdered Qasem Soleimani while he was on a peace mission in Iraq. That was a blatant, reckless, and criminal act of war by Donald Trump. But the Democrats don't mention it at all because it does not fit with their narrative that Trump is supposedly weak and not as violent and warmongering as they are. So they just leave it out.
And they completely supported that assassination anyway.
Of course they did. But right now they want you to believe, the distinction they're trying to draw is, you want to bomb Iran, you want to bomb Yemen, you want to bomb all these countries, then Kamala Harris is your candidate. That's who you vote for if you want more war. That's what they're saying. And then they say here, the administration, again, we talked about this with Dr. Mohammed Marandi, they say the administration continues to manage the fallout from Trump's reckless and short-sighted decision to pull the United States out of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action to constrain Iran's nuclear weapons ambitions. But of course, the Biden-Harris administration has done absolutely nothing to restore that deal, even though that was one of their promises. And instead, what they're doing is bragging about bombing so-called Iranian-linked targets. So remember the saying, guys, when people tell you who they are, believe them.
I don't know. And then do we want to say something about AOC?
Yeah.
I mean, I know you talked about it on Ranya's show, but, the supposed darling of the so-called squad, the one who, people were tripping over themselves, praising because, she's finally part of the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, having, this huge position in the Democratic Party. And she's going to be the opposition. She's going to change the party from the inside, right? That old adage. What did she do at the DNC? And why is it concerning?
Yeah, she spoke at the Democratic National Committee. She's the young face, supposedly, of millennials or Gen Z or whatever it is. She's a person of color. She's supposed to bring the young progressive people to the party. There's a short clip of her speech that has been circulating. Just a few seconds. Let's watch it.
She is working tirelessly to secure a ceasefire in Gaza and bringing hostages home.
Yeah. So she said she
Sounds
is
like
working.
Hillary Clinton. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yes. She. I didn't. I mean, it's uncanny. It is.
It's weird.
Yeah. But she's talking about Kamala Harris, and she says she is working tirelessly to bring a ceasefire in Gaza, which is an outright lie. I mean, there's no evidence that Kamala Harris is doing anything at all to bring about a ceasefire. Kamala Harris has rejected the one thing that could bring about a ceasefire, which is an end to U.S. arms shipments to Israel. In fact, Kamala Harris has specifically rejected this, and you can see that in this statement from her top national security advisor, Phil Gordon. That was earlier this month, and you can see he says there that she, Kamala Harris, does not support an arms embargo on Israel. And then if we another, avatar of the so-called progressive wing of the Democratic Party is Senator Bernie Sanders. Let's take a look at a clip of what he said at the Democratic National Convention this week.
Must end this horrific war in Gaza. Bring home the hostages and demand an immediate ceasefire.
Okay.
Demand a ceasefire from whom, Bernie?
Right.
From which party is in power right now?
Yes. And notice what he left out. And it's the same as what AOC left out, and it's the same as what the platform leaves out, which is that they're both calling for a ceasefire, but the demand, as you noted, Nora, is not directed at anyone. They're not demanding that President Biden impose a ceasefire, and they're not directing any demand at the Democratic Party or the administration for an arms embargo. It is really just gesturing and virtue signaling in the hope that them just saying the magic word ceasefire will make us all forget about the daily ongoing massacres Israel is committing with the bombs the Democratic administration is airlifting to Israel night and day. And they are completely on message with what is coming out of the State Department from Secretary of State Blinken's talking points, which try to position or reposition the Democratic Party, which is the ruling party in the United States, and the Biden-Harris administration not as direct participants in this genocide, which of course they are, but rather as hapless bystanders and even neutral mediators. So let's take a look at this tweet from the State Department that just shows the similarity of the messaging. This is what I want to point out. You can almost hear Bernie reading this. It's time for this war to end. And in the tweet at the top, they talk about, I think they mentioned the word, they use the word ceasefire. So again,
it's time for it to end, as if 200,000 or more people killed by this genocide was okay. That's the implicit message there being sent.
That's right.
Yeah. And who are they appealing to here? They're the ones sending the bombs.
Yeah.
You
this
don't
is
need
from Biden. This is Biden.
Yeah.
Who, who like someone always points out on Twitter every few weeks. It's like Biden, states these platitudes, whatever, as though he's like, who's the president here? I'd like to have a word with him, as though he's not the one directly sending the weapons to shred the people for the suffering that he supposedly wants to stop.
100%.
And as though Israel hasn't said just in the last couple of days that they will not accept a ceasefire if it means ceasing the fire on Gaza. So it's not Hamas or the Palestinians that are being obstructionist. It has always been Israel and the U.S. State Department providing.
Right. But there's something very interesting going on here, because the Democrats aren't stupid. The DNC are not stupid. They spend millions of dollars, tens of millions, hundreds of millions on political consultants, on poll testing, on focus groups and everything. And think back to the beginning of this genocide, when we were saying ceasefire, say ceasefire, Bernie, demand a ceasefire. And remember, there was even that reporting that State Department and Biden administration officials had been instructed not to use the word ceasefire. And the word went out to the American clients and vassals. Some people might remember that clip of Justin Trudeau, the governor of Canada, of America's Canadian state of Canada, when he said we need he started to say the word ceasefire, and then he remembered the instruction: you're not allowed to say the word ceasefire. So they came up with all of these different words like humanitarian pause and I don't know what, just not to say ceasefire. Then they figured it out. Well, we'll just say ceasefire, but we'll empty it of any meaning. So now they won't stop saying ceasefire. But what they won't do is attach to that, like it's just you throw it into the sea. We want a ceasefire. We want a ceasefire. We wish we knew who is responsible for all this, and we only wish they would bring about a ceasefire. So that's why, and I said this yesterday on Rania's show, the demand has to be very specific. It's not a ceasefire alone. It is a ceasefire that can only be brought about by ending the day and night 24/7 flow of Kamala Harris and Joe Biden bombs to Israel. That's what will bring about a ceasefire within days, if not sooner. That's what would do it. And that's the thing that is totally absent. So it's absent from the platform. It's absent from any of their speeches. And on the contrary, the only thing they are promising is we will continue sending Israel billion upon billion upon billion worth of weapons. So it's important to note that bait and switch. And I'll just say one more thing on the ceasefire, because the really what it has become is, and this is very clear from looking at the diplomacy, the back and forth, the constant rounds of negotiations and proposals, and Antony Blinken going back and forth, and Qatar and Egypt as mediators and so on. The Biden-Harris administration and Netanyahu have exactly the same goal with these so-called negotiations, which is to have negotiations for the sake of negotiations, not to achieve a result. Why is that? It's because the Democrats want to make this issue go away. So they are trying to turn this into like an endless process. Oh, you don't like all the killing? Well, we support a ceasefire. Kamala Harris is even trying to bring about a ceasefire. The State Department is tweeting that it wants a ceasefire. Nobody wants a ceasefire more than we do. It's become like the two-state solution. This slogan. You say, well, you don't like what Israel is doing, but we want a two-state solution, and we're yearning for that, and we're working for that, and maybe in a few decades' time there'll be a two-state solution.
The peace process, the ceasefire process.
Yeah.
The ceasefire process, exactly, Asa. That's such a great way to put it. And then for Israel, of course, the negotiations are simply a way for Netanyahu in particular to alleviate both domestic and international pressure. And that's an old Israeli trick. And within Israel, it's very clear, like just while we were on air, the families forum of the Israeli prisoners of war and captives in Gaza said, we're boycotting the official government event commemorating them or calling for their release, because this government does not want them to come home and continues to kill them. So I just want to emphasize to people, the Democratic Party is on the side of genocide. Kamala Harris is on the side of genocide. Many people are smart and listen, and I learn from people's interpretations. It's important to listen to what they're saying carefully and to read carefully between the lines and not to be taken in by buzzword. Sadly, what it's become, just a buzzword like ceasefire, or the language of empathy about Palestinian suffering, which is just, as you said, Nora, it's a natural disaster. No, they're inflicting the suffering. They're sending the bombs. Kamala Harris and Joe Biden are blowing Palestinian babies apart. They can stop it. They refuse to do it. And they want you to go away and stop asking them anything from them. All they want is their votes so they can continue murdering Palestinians, helping Israel murder Palestinians, and sow chaos and war around the world. That's what they want from you. Are they, quote, better or worse than Donald Trump? Well, again, as we saw, the Democrats want you to believe, because it's in writing in their platform, that they are more warmongering than Donald Trump. I'm not telling you who to vote for. I'm not saying who to vote for, but be informed. And this is the reality. And
AOC is on the side of genocide as well.
100%.
I want to say one thing about AOC, which is that, I think a lot of people now are a bit more aware to just the sheer fakery of her whole candidacy as this supposed progressive politician who's now openly in the same trench of genocide. And I just want to say that we at the Electronic Intifada told you so. I tweeted earlier today on Twitter saying that I hated AOC before it was cool. And I was looking back at my old tweets, and I'm reminded that, Ali, that back in 2020, you wrote an article called "Why is AOC Honoring an Israeli War Criminal?" And even back then, she intended, there was this whole, people can go back and read the article. There was this Israel lobby event, which was set to honor Yitzhak Rabin, who infamously ordered Israeli troops to break the bones of Palestinian children during the first Intifada, this Israeli war criminal, former general and so forth. And she was basically putting up this test flag at the time to signaling to the Israel lobby that she wasn't going to be a threat to them. She was forced to back down after your reporting about that, Ali, and she's moved so much even more closer to the Israel lobby since then. Yeah, thank you, Tamara. There it is on the screen there. Why is AOC honoring an Israeli war criminal? And there was a lot of denial at the time of people saying, oh, it was an unfortunate incident. It was a misunderstanding. No, it wasn't. She was signaling what she intended to do. So, when we tell you that these Democrats and these supposed left-wing Democrats and these supposed left-wing Labour Party people, for that matter, are fake, you should probably believe us.
It's a good rule of thumb.
Yeah.
For sure. We'll have more probably next week on the last few days of the convention in terms of the protests, and I'm sure we'll have a brief discussion on whatever Harris says. So stay tuned for that next week. But Ali, I know you wanted to also talk about Osama Hamdan in the context of what we were just talking about, the ceasefire process, and how Israel and the U.S. are continuing to completely obstruct.
Yeah, just very briefly, because there's all this, stuff that's supposed to confuse us with, Blinken saying, Antony Blinken saying, and the US media repeating that the ball is in Hamas's court. And he just explained, Osama Hamdan, of course, is a senior member of Hamas, and he gave an interview to Al Jazeera yesterday, and he said that, Netanyahu and Blinken are engaging in, quote, a festival of lies and the sowing of fantasies, which I thought was a wonderful phrase. And he just said that, he said a lot, but just the key points for me was that he said that in the last round of mediated talks in Doha last week, the Israelis reneged on a number of issues that had been guaranteed in President Biden's proposal that he gave in that speech back in May. According to Hamdan, the Israelis now reject withdrawal from the Netzarim corridor, and they added the new condition, which is that they'll search everyone moving between the north and south of Gaza. They rejected withdrawal from the Philadelphia corridor, that's the border with Egypt, and talk only about redeployment. And they rejected handing over the Rafah crossing. And they have also made a lot of other changes in terms of the prisoner exchange, according to Osama Hamdan, all of which is designed to make any agreement impossible. And he reiterated that Hamas stands by its acceptance of Biden's proposal and other initiatives, the UN Security Council resolution that was passed, I think that was in June. And he said that we will work with any proposal or initiative that guarantees these basic points: an end of the aggression against the Palestinian people, a complete Israeli withdrawal from Gaza, aid and shelter for the Palestinian people and those who have been displaced and who have lost their homes, reconstruction and the lifting of the siege, and a just exchange of prisoners. That's the bottom line of the resistance. And I don't think there's going to be a way to achieve an agreement without that.
Yeah. Yeah. John, did you want to say anything about the, there was a proposal, some meeting between Egypt and Israel about the Philadelphia corridor and the Rafah crossing.
Yeah, I mean, Israel's violating a treaty with Egypt to be in the corridor that they negotiated after the disengagement from Gaza, from their withdrawal from Gaza. And so the fact, I mean, Egypt obviously plays a critical role in the siege of Gaza. That's always been true. But this is next level. This closing, the indefinite closing of the Rafah crossing, is a devastating reality for Palestinians to be navigating right now. The number of people that aren't able to get out for desperately needed hospital care in a land of destroyed hospitals. The crossing is, Egypt's been very non-committal on being on rectifying this situation of their agreement along this corridor. The Rafah crossing has to be opened. Israel being in charge of it indefinitely is a humanitarian disaster.
Yeah, and there was, I read something about how Egypt and Israel agreed that Israel could maintain a military presence on the Egyptian side of the Rafah border crossing if it allowed Palestinians to once again administer and operate the crossing itself. I mean, is that even...
I don't know. It's hard to imagine in this circumstance what it looks like, what Israel leaving the corridor looks like. If they're not going to do it in ceasefire negotiations, they don't care about their people. They're letting their people die. Yeah. It's hard to see Israel turning that over to Hamas, basically confirming that they lost the war. It's a devastating part of this conflict that crossing is closed, and Egypt has the right to demand that their demilitarized zone be adhered to. And Israel's doing the opposite. They're making military positions along that corridor again, which goes back to the 1980s when they made the corridor in the first place with the Egyptian peace deal. The first thing the Israelis did, the last thing they did, the first thing they did was to make that corridor, to divide Rafah, Egypt from Rafah, Gaza, dividing families. So this is a long story on this corridor. It is a strategic corridor. It's the only way for Palestinians to exit Gaza because the Israelis don't let them through the other crossings.
Well, we'll update as necessary on that. And one final discussion topic. Ali, is there anything else you wanted to say about Blinken and kind of what comes next? Every time Blinken meets Israeli leaders, a new round of massacres happens in his wake. What can we foresee in terms of Blinken's trip to the region, and especially, in the context of what we heard from Marandi, where an Iranian response is imminent. Oh, you're muted, Ali.
Yeah, we don't know if it's imminent, but it's coming.
It could be, right, yeah.
Yeah, just very quickly, I wanted to highlight this story that appeared today, if we can put it up, that's in Middle East Eye and other sources, but it says that a senior U.S. official has criticized Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu for making, quote, maximalist statements that are not constructive to getting a ceasefire deal across the finish line. So this is just, again, the Americans pretending, and I suspect that senior official was Blinken himself. And again, trying to paint the United States as the good guys, trying to pressure a recalcitrant Israel without really applying any real pressure to them. It's just a game of good cop, bad cop. The bottom line here is that if Joe Biden or whoever is running the United States makes that phone call to the Pentagon, to Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, and says, stop the airlift, stop the 24/7 flying of baby buster bombs to Israel, this would all end within a couple of days. Israel's totally dependent on Israel, but they don't want to do that. And these leaked stories, these cowardly leaked stories, are designed to make you think that Blinken is the good guy here, and that it's just, we just can't convince Netanyahu. Don't fall for it. This genocide is run from the White House.
It is. It is. Thank you so much, Ali. There's a lot to get through in the last week, trying to distill it into just a few discussion topics. But thank you. Let's take a look at the website and talk about some of the features that we've published in the last few days. There's so many. We are overwhelmed with submissions at the moment.
So many people in Gaza sending stories, and we as you said, Nora, we're publishing so many, but for us, we called this a slow week because we've been, rotating, giving editors much needed time to rest and recover and just kind of gather themselves over this month of August, which means that our capacity to edit and publish has been reduced necessarily, but very temporarily, and yet we're still publishing so much, and just in awe of the fact that people in Gaza, in particular, continuing to write and to want to record and share and bear witness to what they're doing, and it's an honor for us to have this role, and it's a lot. It's a big role, but we're just thankful to everyone who helps us do it. And of course, to all my colleagues, I'm very grateful to each and every one of you, and to all our colleagues you don't see as often on the live stream, but whose work is no less essential and vital. So
absolutely.
We're here for the long haul. That's the thing I want to say, is that we're here. We're going to be here for the long haul because this is the mission that we've taken on, and we're proud to do it.
Yeah, we are. And Asa's putting in some comments from our viewers down below. I just want to also encourage people to sign up for our email list. You'll get notified of these live streams, as well as a daily digest of everything that we've published that day. And also you can use the Donate Now link there at the top of the page, but also in the YouTube description below to keep supporting us. We are supporting so many writers in Gaza at the moment, and it is our greatest honor to be able to do that. And we can only do that with your support. So thank you so much for donating. And if you can't donate, please like and share. That's also as important to us and to our writers to distribute their incredible pieces and features and blog posts and narratives that we've been publishing. So thank you for that. I do want to thank Maureen Claire Murphy for the pre-production and writing. Also Ellie Gerzon for the incredible social media videos that they're producing for us. I also want to give a special shout out to Ghassan Rafidi for some technical help that I needed today, and also for the great snacks. And to everyone at the Electronic Intifada, Ali, John, Asa, Tamara, of course, Tamara, thank you so much for everything you do behind the scenes. It was very elegantly done today, especially with the Morandi interview. And thanks on behalf of everyone. Thank you, and we'll see you next week.